Hello, so hopefully we're live. Let me just grab my book. Today, this is the third reading of Hypnotherapy Revealed, the Ericksonian Approach. So just give people time to come in. Literally haven't yawned all evening, and now I sit in front of a camera. So this is the third part of this, and that is one already. And there's quite a lot to cover today, purely because tomorrow there's quite a lot to cover, and I don't want to cover even more tomorrow. I just want to be able to focus predominantly on the final, apart from the conclusion, the final main chapter. If you find this interesting or helpful, feel free to give it a thumbs up. If you find it, if you're not subscribed already and you want to, feel free to subscribe. I've probably bored everyone and made everyone else disappear already. Yes, skip the 7-minute ad. So I'll do similar to yesterday, where while I read the hypnotic language pattern sections, I literally haven't yawned, and then I sit in this seat and I yawn. While I read the language pattern sections, I'll obviously stop and start, see if there's any comments that, questions or anything during those sections. So let me just have a bit of my water. So I will give people just a few more minutes. It has become that, I think. Literally, I've watched The Simpsons. I've watched a couple of YouTube videos. I've watched Sky at Night, and all of that since 6 p.m. And now I'm sat here to do this. I've had a cup of coffee, dinner, cup of coffee at about 6:30, and not felt tired, not yawned, and then I sit down in this chair and start yawning. So it's a bit like when an actor obviously gets the giggles sitting in one location, and then every time they sit there, they just automatically start laughing. I try to be thorough if I can. Probably too thorough sometimes. Or at least I try to explain things and try to answer the questions I think I might get asked as counter questions or follow-up questions. Part of it is that I think, if I answer everything that someone might think of to ask me as a follow-up thing, I don't have to keep answering. Or at least, I don't have to keep coming back to it. And part of it was also that I was reading the question, I think, further up than everyone was commenting. So I kind of wanted to make sure I'd hopefully answered everything, so I wouldn't have to scroll down and then end up seeing all these comments at the bottom of follow-up questions, but in the gap between the responding to something higher up and then responding to something lower down, I might have been talking about other things for 20 minutes or something. So been 4 minutes. That's enough time to give people time to get here. Presuppositions. Presuppositions work like post-hypnotic suggestions. As you're repeatedly presupposing specific outcomes, you are setting up future responses. If the responses... The good thing is I know the yawning stops after a little while. My brain says, you don't need to keep yawning. If the responses that are being set up are associated with a behavior that will definitely happen, then this also increases the likelihood of the suggestion being followed. Presuppositions are where you presuppose an outcome using terms like when, after, while, during, as, before. They're useful for making someone think along certain lines, and can also be useful for setting up ideas for the client to think about, which builds up a future of having that outcome. Sometimes, immediately, directly presupposing can seem too intrusive or pushy. Sometimes it can be better to start a sentence in a way that sounds harmless, like starting a sentence with the word would, or starting it applying to a third party. Some examples of presuppositions. Have you ever been in a trance before? So the question is before the one they're in or before the one they're going to go into. While your unconscious mind works at creating the changes that you desire, you can begin to relax while implying that this is happening. What would it be like if you discovered that when you wake up tomorrow, that old problem is gone? What will be the first thing you notice? Starting non-threatening with would, and then moving to when, implying that the problem will be gone, and will, implying there'll definitely be things to notice. Presuppositions are just where you imply something without saying it, like saying, try not to forget what I say, which implies it will be difficult to remember, and so probably will be forgotten. Or have you been in a trance before? Using before implies either before the one they're in now or the one they're going to be going into. Presuppositions are where you're making an assumption that something will be happening. This can be done overtly or covertly. For example, if you say, how would you like to go into hypnosis today? You're implying the client will go into hypnosis. You're expecting it. All you're asking is how that will happen, not whether it will happen or not. With this specific question, there is a chance that they could interpret the sentence literally and say that they would or wouldn't like to go into hypnosis today. The therapist is being curious about the how or when rather than whether something will happen. Presuppositions are a great way of keeping focused on curiosity. The therapist is assuming that change is inevitable, or success is inevitable. The only question is how and when. It's a question of when something will happen, not whether something will happen. So that's the presupposition bit. There's not a lot to say on that. Hopefully that makes enough sense to everyone. If it does, feel free to join in the yawning. Yawn if it makes sense. Vague language. Nominalizations, using words which are non-specific, leads people to have to search internally for meaning. They do a transderivational search. This makes those non-specific words sound meaningful to most people as they find their own meaning. It's useful to use nominalizations and other vague words and terms regularly, especially when you don't know something. They're words that the person has their own meaning for. Nominalization is using words with no fixed meaning, like curious, wonder, development, relaxing, explore, resources, pleasure, excitement, enjoyment, discover, fun, relax, meets your needs, satisfaction. Negative nominalizations can be used as a way of describing the problem, even if the therapist doesn't know all the details. If you use the term anxiety, the client will know what you're talking about, even though the therapist may not really know what it means to the client. If the therapist then talks whilst leaning to look behind the client whilst mentioning anxiety, for example, and puts this into past tense by saying something like the old anxiety, can place that problem in the past. They can also alter the meaning of a nominalization. So they could start with anxiety and the client's meaning and begin to reframe and alter the meaning of the nominalization so that when the client thinks of anxiety, it has different meaning to them now compared to the meaning it had before the session. I worked with an alcoholic. He kept saying it is his addiction. This was how he phrased it. He had his own meaning for what he meant by the phrase, "it is my addiction." I ended up reframing the idea of addiction as being bullied and pushed around and compared it to an abusive relationship. Following this, when he would talk about it being his addiction, he would think about it as him being bullied in an abusive relationship. And he would get angry at the thought that he was letting himself get bullied and abused, which motivated him every time he thought about it to take action against it. Weeks later, he was proud to tell me he was no longer a victim of his addiction. Or the therapist could begin to change the normalization used and start using a different one, building up different meaning for this, for this normalization and for the problem. For example, if someone's talking about being in pain, the therapist may bring in the term discomfort rather than the word pain as they talk about the pain, so that they begin to use the word discomfort or identify with the word discomfort, which has 70% of its letters spelling comfort. I used this for a client in pain. I began using the word discomfort rather than that pain. They gradually started following along with this, using the word themselves when talking about the pain. Then I explained how 70% of discomfort is comfort, which had multiple meanings, and it's a truism. 70% of the word 70% of the word is comfort. But in relation to them now thinking about their pain as discomfort, I was saying that 70% of that discomfort was comfort, which led to a decrease in the experienced pain. Another area with therapeutic normalizations is building your own context through the links between the normalizations. If development was used with talk of business, when talking about business, if development was used with talk of business, the meaning of development to the listener is more likely to be in the context of business, and it could be good or bad. If development was used in the context of what is happening now, then it's more likely to bring up meaning in this context. And development in a personal coaching session is likely to have the person assume it is associated with their personal development. The context the normalization is given in impacts on the meaning of the normalization. New developments are happening in the business. There'll be organizational change and improvements taking place. New developments are happening in your life, and these may lead to organizational changes and improvements taking place, giving you more time for yourself. New developments are happening inside your mind, and you can wonder how these organizational changes and improvements will take place. Suggesting direction but not the way. Normalizations can be used to aid the client non-consciously to begin to spread change to other areas of their life. For example, I had a single therapy session where I worked with a woman that over the phone said she wanted to quit smoking, then came to me and said she wanted to lose weight and stop drinking Coca-Cola and quit smoking. I asked which one of these was most important to her. Quitting drinking Coca-Cola was what she expected to find hardest and was most important to her. I helped her with this issue whilst dropping in normalizations and non-specific ideas for change in other areas to also occur. She lost about 1.5 stones in less than 3 months, cut down on smoking, and had no problem stopping drinking Coca-Cola with no side effects. My aim was to promote a way for her non-consciously to spread change and apply the therapy to all these areas, not just the area I mainly focused on helping her with. Asking things like, you can be curious to discover what other changes occur. A sentence with no specific meaning other than the one the listener places on it, and it doesn't give any direction or content as to what is expected other than change. Given in a context where all change that is happening is positive, the expected change is also likely to be positive. When people are entering hypnosis or perhaps are following along to an induction, one of the most jarring things a therapist can do is to suggest something that doesn't match the experience the client is having in their mind. When hypnotizing people or guiding their inner experience, the therapist can talk about, I wonder whether there are any clouds in the sky and what they look like. This statement is vague. If there aren't clouds in the client's inner experience, that's fine. If there are, and the clouds are stormy, that's fine. If there are light, wispy clouds, that's also okay. If the therapist says, and you can see that clear blue sky, they may be wrong. The sky in the client's mind may be dark and stormy, so this suggestion can be jarring and can interrupt the flow of their experience. If the therapist knows information, like if the client has said about a stormy sky, then this can be said specifically as the therapist knows it's true. If the therapist doesn't know, then it's best to be curious about what the client is experiencing, like I mentioned above about the clouds. If the therapist wants something specific in the client's experience, then the therapist can suggest the discovery of it rather than directly saying that it is there. Like saying, I wonder whether, or I wonder when, you'll notice the stream, and when you become aware of that stream, just take some time to drift deeper into the experience. By being curious, the therapist is guiding and narrowing the client's attention on having them noticing what their own inner experience is without dictating to them what they have to experience. Using vague language is naturally hypnotic. When vague language is used, clients have to find out what the therapist is talking about. To do this, they go on an internal search for meaning to create their version of what the therapist is saying so that they can understand it. An everyday version of this is politician speak. For example, you've all come here today to listen to what I can do for you, and I'll make all those changes to education you know need to be made. I'll make those big decisions, those tough decisions, doing what the other party has failed to do, because it's what you want, it's what we want, it's what is right. None of this means anything, but at the same time, it means almost everything. Every listener that cares about education and feels that there are certain tough topics that never seem to get addressed with, assume that the speaker is talking about these issues. By using vague language, the therapist can talk about a range of different topics and keep bringing up the same vague terms or terms with multiple meanings as a way of getting certain ideas across. The therapist can seem to talk about how a gardener knows when it's time to harvest vegetables from the vegetable patch, and then talking about how a singer knows how to breathe correctly for a given song, and actually by mentioning how the client can relax in situations that previously made them anxious. A collection of positive normalizations and ambiguous statements express the true you, positive qualities, purpose, meaning, following your heart, self-realization, self-discovery, authority, leadership skills, top dog, management qualities, taking opportunities for success and achievement, use your strengths to achieve success, charisma, respect, love, connection, special feeling, community, togetherness, meaningful. So that's the end of that chapter. Before I move on to the next one, let's have a look. Transderivational searches are fun to say. You're a silent intruder who spoke up. Yes, discomfort does sound less severe than pain, but then you are saying comfort every single time you say it or focus on it. So that's always a good thing. As mentioned, it comes down to how you end up presenting it. So generally, So this is referring to the, telling someone they experience discomfort can annoy them when they obviously feel pain. Um, Generally, you would start off using what they say, so and you would use their language. So it's a bit like many things. If you work with a fat person, you talk about them being a fat person. You don't try and come up with some soft term that they would never refer to themselves as. You match where they're at and how they're talking about themselves, because you want to show respect to how they perceive things for themselves. Um, just like you would never want to say to somebody who's, say, angry, that they need to calm down. You need to kind of acknowledge the anger and talk about the anger or whatever, and be at that place with them in terms of how you're communicating, not trying to, like, think something different. But what you can do is occasionally drop in the word discomfort, perhaps into what you're saying, only if it's appropriate to do so. So you would kind of know this based on how they're responding or whatever, and at what point you would do it. But you wouldn't just do it like. The big thing is, obviously, as I talked about right at the beginning, it's about learning the underlying sort of principles behind why you're doing everything, learning the principles behind an Ericksonian approach. So it's observation, utilization, having a goal, and being curious. And if you're doing all those things, all of this is like the additional stuff on top of that. So the fact that language can change experience is knowledge that you can use. It's an observation that you can use when it's appropriate to use it. So with someone where clearly saying something like discomfort is going to end up irritating them and just making them angry that you're not validating and accepting the experience they're having, you just wouldn't say that or do that. And even if you said it once as like a tester thing, you would then see what the response is. And if it looked like it didn't improve things at all, or didn't have any, it looked like it would probably not go down well if you did that more than just the once. Like, maybe it would be perceived as like it was just, they would think, oh, did he just say what I thought he said? Or, they're not necessarily instantly, I'm offended that you made an off the cuff discomfort word use there. So you wouldn't do it as like a direct comment. You might do it as you're referencing something. So it's all about, all of this other stuff is all like the language patterns and everything is all about just what are your observations and how you're utilizing your observations towards the goal. And this is where I said before about the whole flipping it around the other way, that most courses teach you all the language patterns. So most Ericksonian hypnosis courses and NLP courses that teach Ericksonian hypnosis, they teach you all of the language patterns, and then students go out there trying to use all the language patterns, and they completely miss the point. They don't end up realizing that actually that wasn't the right place and time to use it. They were so focused on trying to use certain techniques, they weren't paying attention to the client and responding to the client as an individual, which is obviously the most important thing, is to respond to clients as individuals, be very client responsive, not kind of therapist focused of, oh, I heard Dan say that comfort, 70% of it's comfort, so let's use that with this client because Dan says it and it's worked for him. So with this client, it's going to work for me. That's the wrong way to obviously think about it. But having the knowledge that it can work when the situation's right, and when you just know, right, this feels like an opportunity where I can change this wording slightly and just make that subtle shift from pain to discomfort while talking. Likewise, you could make that shift of, just asking people where the pain isn't so bad. So you're still kind of implying that the pain is bad, but you're softening it a bit rather than just saying, where does it feel better in your body? And the person might say, it doesn't, I hurt all over. Where it's saying, where doesn't it feel so bad, obviously softens it a bit and gets the information of, there are parts of you where it isn't as bad, where it's better, but you're not directly saying that. So you're gradually, likewise, you can do things like, does it hurt more here or here, is another kind of way you can do it. So there's so many different things you could do to help someone, that the important thing is, obviously here I'm just talking about one very specific type of language pattern and not saying here's how to approach everyone. And the important, that's why I make sure this is later in the book, because hopefully by now people who are reading it know, right, the very important thing, like why my scripts book is book 3, is that people have hopefully read book 1 and 2, so that when they get to the scripts, they know, and I say in the scripts book, don't just read these scripts. So hopefully by the time you actually get to one of the physical scripts, you know the last thing you should be doing is reading those scripts. You should be going through them, getting a couple of ideas from them, and seeing how it could be presented, like how you could, as a trainee therapist or even a more experienced therapist, you could watch client sessions of other therapists and think, oh, I quite like the way they did that. I quite liked that, felt soft and gentle and felt like a really friendly way of approaching the client. Maybe I should adapt a bit more of that kind of outlook with my clients, or, you kind of take that kind of view on. Yeah, smoking's one of those things I've always wanted to do and never ever done. I've always wanted to say yes when people offer me cigarettes, but have never ever done it. Yeah, politicians speak is always an interesting one to analyze. What do you mean using third party with presuppositions? Yes, telling someone who is angry or upset to calm down is a good way to get punched in the face. That's obviously true. I don't know, my entire life, possibly because my dad was a stupidly heavy smoker. He smoked about 60 cigarettes a day and would cut the filters off of them because he said the filters made them too weak, that you'd barely notice you're even smoking. And literally, from as young as I remember, I've always had that kind of craving for thinking, I want a cigarette, I want a cigarette, I want a cigarette. And as a teen, obviously in the UK, we used to be able to smoke in pubs and things, and clubs and other indoor places for most of, until like 2007 or whatever it was. So growing up and going through my early life, my early adult life, people would constantly, most people you knew smoked. It would be incredibly rare to meet someone who didn't smoke. And so you would just naturally always be offered cigarettes. And my default brain instinct would always be yes. And I'd have to remind myself, I don't smoke. I never want to smoke. Um, I know that it's incredibly bad for me. And I know that it can be very difficult to quit. So I never want to have a cigarette. So I've never even tried smoking, but my entire life, my brain has always just wanted to say yes and has always wanted to smoke. And I've always just sort of put it down to, maybe it was because I grew up in a household with, at least for the first 5 years of my life, with a dad who smoked 60 a day. And then my stepdad smoked as well, but nowhere near as much. But he smoked as well. So I always grew up with smokers at home. So, binds. A bind is where you offer more than one choice with the same outcome. For a bind, the choice can be consciously chosen. You give people conscious choice. They can pick which response they want to follow. They also have the option of rejecting all choices. For example, would you like to sit in the left or the right chair to go into hypnosis? The implication is, whichever chair they choose to sit in, they're agreeing to go into hypnosis. Binds are of great use to therapists because they appear to offer choice. They make the client feel that they're in control because they're choosing, while the whole time the choices only have one outcome. If the therapist uses a double bind, they presuppose one direction whilst the client thinks they are always making the choices. All binds offer an illusion of choice. The therapist is offering different options that lead to the same or similar outcomes. What clients focus on is the choice point, not the implication or outcome. If the therapist suggests, do you think the left hand or the right hand will lift as you go into hypnosis? The client's attention is focused on which hand they think will lift. And they can even say that neither hand, and this response can be linked into the double bind. Yet, all the responses lead to a single outcome of going into hypnosis. The question is about which hand they think will lift, not a question of whether they think they'll go into hypnosis. If they say they think the left hand will lift, they're saying they think the left hand will lift as they go into hypnosis. If they say they think the right hand will lift, they're saying they think the right hand will lift as they go into hypnosis. If they say neither hand will lift, they're saying neither hand will lift as they go into hypnosis. What isn't in question is that they'll go into hypnosis. The only question is whether they are right or wrong. They may say the left hand and the right hand might lift, or both hands may remain stationary as they go into hypnosis. And so they may be right about their choice of hand, but this doesn't change the outcome. A bind on its own is consciously answerable. If a therapist says to a client, do you want to sit in this chair or that chair to go into hypnosis, the client can decide about what chair to sit in. They can also refuse to sit in either chair, in which case they won't be going into hypnosis. Double binds are a class of language pattern where the therapist offers choice to the client, but it doesn't matter which choice they follow, the outcome will still be the desired one. With double binds, the outcomes are often non-conscious, so the client has little chance to sabotage it. And the bind options are more about noticing or discovering rather than actively choosing the goal. Whereas a bind is a conscious choice which can easily be sabotaged. A bind, do you want to sit in this chair or that chair to go into hypnosis? A double bind, I wonder whether you'll sit in one of the chairs, stand up, or do something different as you go into hypnosis. The bind can be ignored by standing up or lying on the floor or just flatly deciding I'm not going to go into hypnosis. The double bind leaves it open for almost any response to occur for the person to enter hypnosis. Do something different could mean almost any response, and as being used instead of to means it's going to happen. The question is, what will they be doing whilst hypnosis is developing? Some more examples of double binds. I wonder whether you'll go deeper into hypnosis with the sound of my voice or the spaces between my words. Which hand do you think will lift as you enter hypnosis, or do you think neither hand will move? Do you think that left hand will get warm first, or will it be the right hand? The implication is that one hand will get warm, then the other. They can say which hand they think will be the first to get warm. They could be right or wrong. All they're asked for is their opinion on what response they'll give first. I wonder whether you'll go deeper into hypnosis with the sound of my voice, or will it be with each out-breath that you take? The implication is that they'll go deeper into hypnosis and that they are already in hypnosis. They have to wait to discover if it will be with my voice or their breathing that takes them deeper. You can forget to remember the things you forgot, or remember to forget the things that you remember. Double bind for amnesia. You can be curious about the rigidity in that arm without being aware of it, or aware of the rigidity in the arm without paying it any attention. A double bind for catalepsy. I don't know whether you'll see what isn't there, or believe that you see it without being able to see it. A double bind for hallucination. I don't know whether you'll discover an hour of hypnotic time can seem like a minute, or you can discover a minute of waking time can stretch into an hour. A double bind for time distortion. I don't know whether you'll drift back into a pleasant memory, unaware of the future, or discover yourself in a memory, curious about what the future holds. A double bind for regression. You can be aware of that hand, unaware that it is yours, or know that it's your hand, but be unaware of it. A double bind for anesthesia. I don't know whether you'll decide not to stop smoking until the end of this session, or decide to stop smoking before that. It's easy to forget how easy it was to remember that you smoked, while finding it hard to forget how easy it is to remember how many happy memories. I don't know whether your unconscious mind will keep your mouth closed if you try to smoke, or if you try to get to put a cigarette in your mouth, you find that it won't open. I don't know whether you'll enjoy life more because you no longer smoke, or whether it'll be because you have cleaner lungs. Will the memory that comes to mind be a motivated one, or will it be a memory of high motivation? Will you maintain a cleaner and healthier lifestyle to prove to others how capable you are, or will it be to prove that to yourself? You may get a temporary craving over the next few days. I wonder whether it'll be your extra energy that fills that craving, or will it be that smile that shows you the pleasure you have because of your success? Will you decide honestly and unconsciously to show people that you're proud of who you are, or show them that you're proud of who you've become? I wonder whether you think you'll be aware of making the unconscious choice to permanently stop smoking now, or whether it'll just happen without your awareness. There are times you can remember when you forgot what you tried to remember. There are also times you can remember when you forgot what was on your mind only seconds ago. Remembering that you forgot to try to remember what it was that you forgot, like now finding that you remember you'll forget if you try to remember, but knowing you've not forgotten what you didn't try to remember, forgetting why you're even trying, when you know that you'll just forget everything that I've said, but knowing it's not forgotten unconsciously. There are many types of double binds. If you learn what is in this chapter and follow the fundamental principles, you'll automatically be doing the different double binds. Once you feel confident with the Ericksonian approach, it can be worth exploring the language patterns further to help to refine your skill and enhance your knowledge. There are double dissociation double binds, conscious unconscious double binds, reverse set double binds, time binds, non sequitur double binds. So that's the end of the double bind chapter. I think there's one more chapter of language, two more chapters of language patterns. It would depend on the individual client. So in relation to benefits of creating amnesia. So it depends if it's relevant. So for example, say you're working with someone with pain, something that can be helpful. Milton Erickson used to talk about the fact that people make pain 3 times worse for themselves, or make pain a lot worse for themselves, because they have remembered past pain. So you remember you've been in pain all this time. They have future pain, sort of future projected pain. So you're aware in the moment that you're going to be in pain for the foreseeable future potentially, and you've got the pain here in the present. So something Milton Erickson used to do was give people amnesia for the fact they've ever had pain before, and then also make it so that they don't expect any pain, so kind of amnesia for the fact they might have pain in the future, so that you've instantly knocked out 2/3 of the kind of psychological component of that pain, because the only thing they've got left is what pain are you experiencing here and now? So that's a time when you could use amnesia. You're not doing it to stop someone sabotaging something. You're doing it as a specific strategy. Um, there are obviously other times where a similar approach might work well, like making someone so they end up with amnesia about having a specific problem or a specific thought process or something, so that they then kind of almost a bit like doing the miracle question, but using amnesia mixed in with that, where it's like they wake up with amnesia that they had a problem, and so they start their day not knowing they even had a problem. So obviously, I'm not saying that you can do that with most people, because there's a lot of complexities that go with things. But just as an example, it could be that something like that became a strategy that you knew with this individual you're working with that you might end up doing because you think actually it's one specific issue that they've got. Or it could be one specific trigger. So it could be, say, for example, someone, talking about smoking. So say, for example, someone had a cigarette with their first coffee in the morning. That was their first cigarette of the morning. And you'd encourage the idea of amnesia for having that, for having cigarettes with coffee. And then you kind of work on installing something else, like they do deep breathing, standing at the back door, gazing out over the back garden while having the coffee, or whatever it happens to be that's been elicited within the therapy. And so when they wake up and have that coffee, they go and follow the suggestion for going out in the back garden, doing some deep breathing, thinking, oh, nice fresh air that I'm breathing in, or whatever it is that they're doing that's come out of therapy. And they do all of that because they forgot that they normally have cigarette with that coffee. So amnesia could be used in lots of kind of, different ways. There's, I'm just seeing, I think I might have all Bill O'Hanlon's books next to me. There's a book here. I might look through some of Bill O'Hanlon's books in a minute. Then I can finish mine first rather than get other people's books out before I've even finished mine. But something that is talked a lot about by Bill O'Hanlon in some of his books is class of problem, class of solution, where you look at what the problem is and you look at what class of hypnotic phenomena it comes in. So if a hypnotic phenomena came involving, say, amnesia as part of the problem, then it could be that the opposite of amnesia, hyperamnesia, is what you use to treat it. If, say, the problem that they do happens to involve hallucination, then you might use a hallucination type, say, negative hallucination. Maybe positive hallucination becomes the treatment. So there are lots of kind of ways where amnesia could be used, but amnesia is far less successful than I think hypnotists give it credit. Hypnotists sort of rave about it frequently as being this really successful thing. The scientific research is that when you ask someone, do you remember this, where you were given amnesia for something, do you remember this, and you actually question them about it, nearly always the person ends up conceding that they do remember it. It's just that they actively are choosing to avoid thinking about it or focusing on it, or it's very rare for someone to say, no, I don't remember that. With a bit of pushing, people end up saying, oh yeah, that, I remember that, and they end up recalling it. And so a bit like with a dream, the way to keep that amnesia kind of there is to move on and avoid it as much as avoid talking about whatever it was that you're trying to make the person have amnesia for as much as possible, and keep their attention off of it, in the same way that to make someone forget a dream, keep their attention off of that dream for as long as possible, so that they're far enough away from attaching to it that they don't attach to it. But even then, if you start questioning them, so if someone woke up and told you their dream as soon as they woke up, and then as soon as you've written down what they've said, you distract them, you make them more alert, maybe you go out for a run or something, and then they tell you, oh, I've forgotten the dream now, I can't remember what it was that I dreamt this morning, and you've got it written down, if you start questioning them about it and start saying something about it that relates to it, you'll gradually make it so they think, oh yeah, I remember now. Yeah, it had that happen and then this happened and I remember that. And they can start grasping. It's not like there's a permanent, perfect amnesia. Um, it's kind of very hard to achieve that would stand up to like scrutiny and stuff like that. It's just like a natural process that when your attention isn't focused on something, you aren't aware of it, kind of thing. That's what it kind of boils down to. Um, Note learning all of this doesn't make it any less effective, because hypnosis isn't about somehow being conned into it or anything. So it isn't about, oh, I don't know it and that's why it works. It's um, about focusing attention and allowing your attention to be focused so that you can become more responsive. So what you're doing is still just focusing attention, however you do it. So you learning it or you hearing it, if you're on the receiving end of it or whatever, it just it's still it's either the right approach for you or it's not. It's nothing to do about, I listen to people do hypnotic language and things, and sometimes I'm analyzing it and thinking, oh, that was done well or that wasn't done so well. It doesn't change whether I'm likely to be hypnotized. I'm not just saying remember to forget repeatedly in many different ways, meaning anything other than forget. So that's the important part, that what I'm telling someone repeatedly is to forget. So with that specific sentence, there are times you can remember when you forgot what you tried to remember. So I'm telling you a truism. There are times that you can recall where you don't remember what it was. Um, yeah, there are times you can recall when you forgot what you were trying to remember. So there are times you can recall, you can sort of say like, oh, the other day I remember that I couldn't remember so and so's, I couldn't remember that person's name. Or the other day I remember that I couldn't remember what the name of that film was. There are times you can. So what I'm telling you is think about forgetting. Essentially, I'm giving you that message. There are also times you can remember when you forgot what was in your mind only seconds ago. So again, I'm just telling you a truism. There are times where you thought, oh, I'll just go and do that. And then you turn your computer on to Google something. And as soon as you see Google, maybe you notice a news article pop up on screen and you think, oh, I'll read that in just a minute, but I've got to Google this first. And then you get onto Google and you think, literally 3 seconds ago, I decided to Google what I want to Google and I can't even remember what that thing was now. Or you think, oh, I'll just go and get that from the other room. And you stand up and walk out your door. Literally 3 seconds later, you've forgotten why you've left the room. And you think, I can't even remember what I was looking for, what I was going to the other room for now. So again, I'm just telling you a truism about forgetting. Remembering that you forgot to try to remember what it was that you forgot. So there are times when you've done that, where you've forgotten to actually try to recall what it was that you forgot at that period of time. You've sort of, you end up thinking later, oh yeah, I was going to look that up and I forgot. And then I forgot that I was going to try to recall what it was that I forgot. And, so you get that. Like now, so I'm telling you, finding that you remember you'll forget if you try to remember, but knowing that you've forgotten what you didn't try to remember, which obviously, of course, you forget what you didn't try to remember. That's quite common. Forgetting why you're even trying, when you know you'll just forget everything that I've said, but knowing it's not forgotten unconsciously. So all I'm doing with it is just giving the message that, or stimulating the idea that you repeatedly have had lots of different experiences of forgetting in different types of contexts. I'm not once telling you to remember anything apart from when I tell you to remember about forgetting. So it's not so much about I just happen to have used the word remember and forget lots of times or anything like that. And then the person might have latched onto the idea of remember because I used that word a lot. Every sentence makes sense, but it's a double bind, but it's a confusion double bind. So I'm constantly telling you to forget. You can constantly agree with every truism of yes, I've had that experience. That's a normal everyday experience. Yep, I've had that experience. That's a normal everyday experience. But I'm doing it in such a way that creates confusion so that you can't then follow it easily. And because you can't follow it easily, you're then likely to go inside your mind to escape the confusion and also wait for some certainty that you can follow. So when I then get near the end and end up saying that you can forget everything that I've said, but knowing it's not forgotten unconsciously, and the like now bit, when I'm saying those things, they are certainty buried within confusion. And so what happens is whenever there's confusion, you want to escape the confusion. So you latch onto any certainty that you get. And they're kind of the islands of certainty among the confusion that you latch onto, making it so that it makes it even more powerful that that's the outcome you're likely to have. And going back to when I was young, I used to do just I love the sound, the way double complex, confusing double binds sound. And so I used to literally just rattle them off all the time and sound incredibly fake because that's what I would do because I would love the sound of them. And so I'd just keep on wanting to sort of say them and I'd want to do lots of confusion techniques like which hand do you think is going to lift up while you go into hypnosis? And the person might say, my left hand. So you think your left hand, left, right there is going to lift up faster than the right hand, left, right over here. Is that right? Um, I think so. Right. And then you just start mixing left and right and using them in different contexts. And um, so I used to do lots and lots of that, which probably annoyed a lot of people in every conversation that I'd ever have. If I found an opportunity to use it, I would. Um, yes, I quite like that sentence as it was coming out of my mouth. I thought, I bet I forget that. So commands and suggestions. I think this is the second to last language pattern bit. And then I think there's one more chapter after that. My view is that commands are telling someone what to do or having authority over someone, whereas suggestions are giving ideas or saying something in an indirect way. Commands can seem more assertive, and so if someone isn't keen on being told what to do, they may not like it and may not respond well to the command, whereas suggestions can feel more comfortable, as the therapist is offering ideas about how something can be done and not necessarily telling someone how to do something. They may also be more indirect and so be giving a fairly direct idea, but in an indirect way to allow the person to do things their way rather than the therapist's. When offering direct commands, a therapist will directly tell the client what they are to do, when and how, and what they recommend the client does. There are a part of these are a part of indirect commands and suggestions. These are a part of the interspersal technique. Marking commands or suggestions as separate from the sentence with either a tonal shift or maybe by pausing before and after the command or with a specific gesture or movement. This causes a pattern that the non-conscious picks up on and responds to. For example, some people find they relax deeply in the shower. Other people find they drift deeper into a dreamy state when they're in the bath. indirectly suggesting relax deeply and drift into a dreamy state. I don't know whether you'll discover that you relax deeply as you listen to my voice, or whether you will discover that you become more fully absorbed in your internal experience with each out breath. Indirectly suggesting you'll discover you relax deeply. You'll discover you become more fully absorbed in your internal experience with each out breath. Embedded commands and suggestions are where you are marking out part of the communication for the client to pick up on and respond to non consciously. This could be done with a gesture or with a head movement, with a tonal shift or a touch. As long as the marking out is done consistently, the client will non consciously pick up on it. Some examples of embedded commands could be: someone asked the other day how you go into hypnosis. I began explaining to them the process of how you go into hypnosis. I explained that firstly, the client will be looking at me while I talk to them and probably won't notice at first how the breathing begins to slow down. And as they begin to relax, I continue talking to them and they go into hypnosis easily and effortlessly. I remember traveling on a plane and discovering how high up it went. It was so difficult not to just close your eyes and fall asleep, with the sound in the cabin and the lights turned down. I couldn't help myself drifting off. Embedded commands are used positively and negatively in everyday situations. For example, doctors or dentists telling you this will hurt. People telling children, you're never going to amount to anything, you're rubbish at maths. Or one of these days you're going to get hurt doing that. Doctors telling the patient, the problem will last for 3 to 6 weeks. To children, you're going to be so successful when you grow up. Analog marking is the process of marking out suggestions, ideas, or communication. This helps the therapist to offer communication that is multi-layered. The client generally will consciously follow along to the bigger picture, to hearing the whole communication, while non-consciously they'll recognize the patterns being conveyed in the communication. It's important to be continually allowing communication to both the client's conscious awareness and to the client non-consciously. Analog marking allows the client to consciously follow along to the communication, whilst non-consciously they're aware of the marked out sections. Because the client non-consciously notices these sections and consciously doesn't, it's like they receive two different messages. I often do this by telling stories or metaphors that the client can consciously listen to, while they non-consciously respond to the patterns in what I'm saying, and also to the sections that get marked out. The My Friend John technique, developed by Milton Erickson, is a good example of this, used in trance induction. It also happens in everyday life. You get people that say, I told him, I'm really annoyed at the lack of respect you show me. As you hear someone talking directly at you like this, it can feel like it's aimed at you. It creates feelings in your body as it affects you on a deeper level, even though logically and consciously, you know they're not talking about you, although they could be using this technique. And so they are talking about you, and they're just hiding the message in the story to indirectly tell you they're annoyed at your lack of respect. I don't know if I mention it in here, but I know one very, very well-known hypnotherapy trainer who talked about how he did this in a shop. Someone cut in front of him, and he kind of did this technique about people being annoying, and then he sort of said the suggestion straight away. There's also someone I know who wanted to punch someone, and they said, you'll never guess what just happened. So and so just walked up to me and went whack, and they punched the person. So you get these sort of things in everyday life. If ideas and suggestions are given indirectly, say via analog marking, then the client is highly unlikely to consciously notice. So it'll only be received non-consciously. If the suggestions were given directly, then the client may consciously become aware and may in the future sabotage the work. When I want to educate someone in therapy and feel that they probably don't see that they don't know what they don't know, I do it indirectly, often by telling them I'm not going to tell them because I'm there as a therapist and they've come to me for help. There's a high chance that they expect me to know what I'm talking about. So if I don't give them reasons to challenge me, then often what I say gets accepted. As an example, in smoking, some people think they know the risks of smoking but don't really. They only know the common few things that get plastered over the media. I want them to understand some of the other issues that they have perhaps never really thought about or considered. But I don't want to lecture them or to have them defend why it won't happen to them. I don't always feel this is necessary. It's obviously client dependent. I'll often say, I know you know all the effects of smoking, so I don't need to tell you that 50% of all smokers die of smoking related illness, etc., etc., etc. Then I tell them what I said I wasn't going to tell them. But the way it's been introduced means they rarely challenge what I'm saying. So I've done that. For example, I was helping a couple to quit smoking, and I said, "Look, I know that you don't want to lecture on, all the things that smoke, all the sort of negatives of smoking, because I know you know that." And then I started reeling them off, and I said, "And I know you know that 50% of all smokers die. So I know that as a couple, you're already obviously very aware that at some future date, one of you will probably be dead, and the other one of you has to live without that loved one in their life. And you already know all of this. You don't need me to tell you it." And then I just kind of carried on therapy. But the sudden look in their face at hearing that one of them could be dead and the other one had to live without them, and obviously their loved ones, and they're sharing this experience of quitting together, etc., made them suddenly very hyper aware about this. But I did it as an off the cuff kind of, I know you know all this, so I'm not even going to bother telling you, and then told them exactly what I wanted them to focus their attention on in that moment. Um, and with teenagers, that's another good way of doing that, where you can say to teenagers, "Look, I know that you think you're grown up, and so I know that you already know how to," and then you just tell them what you want to tell them, but you tell them it as if you're saying, "I know you already know this, so let's just crack on." Um, to make embedded commands as effective as possible, the most important thing is to do them so that the client doesn't consciously notice, and to be consistent with how you do the commands so that the client can non-consciously pick up on the pattern. Every person is different. Talking quickly can cause confusion and allow you to embed commands and use language patterns that move on before they've had time to analyze it, like with the double bind. Or you could talk with a broken rhythm, or even just talk normally but add emphasis to certain words you want to embed with either a movement, gesture, look, tonal shift with your voice, or any other marker that could be picked up on non consciously by the client. If you use shock or confusion inductions or techniques, you want to give clear, direct suggestions. So using embedded commands at these times isn't often the best approach, because the client will come out of hypnosis before you've used enough of them to notice the pattern. Following a shock or surprise induction, you want to give them an escape from their confusion. To do this, you need to give clear suggestions, like saying sleep, followed by continuing to give clear communication, like saying, "That's it. Now just allowing yourself to go deeper and deeper into hypnosis." And I don't know how you'll choose to go deeper, whether it'll be with each out breath or with the words that I say, or perhaps with the spaces between my words. So that's the commands bit. I've got one more chapter on this. If you've suggested something to someone and um, they know they're supposed to do something but can't make out what, then obviously you've obviously suggested it wrong, because the meaning of your communication is how it's received, not how it's given. So they need to know what they need to do. Likewise, it's all very well and good doing, say, marking out. Say I was marking out suggestions by moving my head. So I'm kind of talking here, and then when I want to give a suggestion, I move my head to here and I give the suggestion here. If perhaps intellectually they're not able to understand or grasp that communication, then they won't understand it. It will mean absolutely nothing to them. So you just want to make sure that whatever communication you give is understandable. There are things that you don't want someone to overtry. So, for example, if you go for an arm levitation, the person knows they're supposed to raise their arm if you've been open and said that you want this arm levitation, but they're not going to know how to do that consciously. And if they try and do it consciously, or they try and force it, or they try and think, I've got to be a really good subject and I've got to figure out how to do this, they'll probably fail. So you need to be reinforcing and, sharing with them the fact that you don't want them to be trying consciously to do this. I don't understand the yellow duck comment. What would you do with the yellow duck? Yes, what accent do you want is the question for your confusion. Metaphors. Telling stories and anecdotes, either mirroring the client's situation, laying down a useful pattern, seeding or priming something for future work, can be really effective in therapy. The therapist can set up specific emotions within a metaphor, or perhaps use clients' comments or metaphors for rapport, or use metaphors to lay down patterns non consciously in the client. A story about circling a fort held by an evil invader, not letting food or water get into the fort, and not letting the invader escape. After a short while, all the invaders die. Could be used to fight warts, verrucas, or even perhaps help with cancer treatment. Metaphors are probably one of the most powerful techniques. There is a story I have mentioned previously of Milton Erickson teaching a boy who used to wet the bed about muscle control by talking about baseball, which is needed for baseball and controlling the bladder. Ideally, the story or metaphor will be something that will come from the client and something the client can relate to. The story needs to be absorbing and acceptable. Metaphors, stories, and examples are a useful tool in hypnotherapy because they allow the therapist to prime for things to take place. For example, if the therapist wants to elicit an arm levitation, they can prime it in advance by talking about being desperate to politely get attention in class at school, or reaching up to put shopping away, or hailing a taxi, or stopping a bus. All of these stories seed or prime the client with the idea of arm levitation, making them more likely to do it as those patterns in the mind are activated. If the therapist wanted to help someone forget pain, they could talk to them about being in a cinema and needing the toilet as they enter, but getting so engrossed in the film that they forget they need the toilet. Or having fun playing as a child and not noticing any bumps and bruises or cuts until later when they're at home. Again, these stories then activate related neurological processes. Stories also allow the therapist to lay down future useful patterns. If the answer to the problem is to be patient, the therapist can tell a story that gives this message. If the answer to a problem is to relax, they can lay down this pattern. They can be as abstract or as literal as they like. They could lay down a relax pattern by talking about a stick floating on a river that gets wider and wider, and as it does, the water slows down and isn't as rough, and the stick floats slower and more gently. Or they could talk about a friend that had a situation at work that really was annoying them and how they overcame this. This second option would mirror the situation with a recognizable alternative way of handling things. They can also talk about past successes they've had with other clients in similar situations and what those clients did to move on. A metaphor is just a pattern or template that can be taken, understood, and used by the client non consciously. It's about using the client's language. The client doesn't necessarily interpret the content, it takes the raw pattern from the metaphor and sees how this applies to the current situation. In the same way that a dozen very different crime novels may share the same underlying pattern, the presenting problem and solution is only one story on a pattern which many other stories can be overlaid onto. When reading a crime novel, most people don't notice that the structure is the same as the previous stories by that author, and the same as dozens of other novels. To notice that have to go to notice that they have to go beyond the content. It isn't that the reader was unaware of this as a being, they were just unaware of it because they weren't focusing on it. It doesn't take much questioning of a reader to elicit that they were aware of it on some level, especially with regular readers of the same type of stories. When a therapist doesn't know what to do with a case, or quite what the answer or way forward is, generic metaphors can be helpful. Generic metaphors can also be helpful when working with groups or more than one person at a time. For example, I worked with a group to test this idea and ended the group training by saying that one of them had something they wanted help with, but didn't get a chance to have me help them with it. I said, I know who they are and what that problem is and what help they need, but also respect their privacy. So we'll tell them a story that is specifically for them. Everyone else can just relax and enjoy the story, but you, the person with the problem, will understand how this relates to you and how this can help you to move forward, even if you don't understand that now consciously. I then told a generic metaphor that had many patterns in it, but wasn't actually targeted at any specific individual in the room. And over the months following this experience, many of the course participants contacted me to thank me for the metaphor I gave them personally and told me how it had helped them. Each individual assumed the metaphor was for them, and they found the meaning they needed, even though it wasn't actually aimed at anyone specifically. Our language is full of metaphors, from saying, he's a pain in the neck, or I've been feeling blue, or I feel trapped in a rut, or the news hit me like a sledgehammer, through to more rounded and detailed metaphors. When the metaphors that the therapist uses for treatment have come from or have been developed from what the client has said, they are often more impactful and effective. If a client talks of a stabbing pain of a headache, the therapist could talk of blunting that pain or shielding that area from the stabbing. And these would be likely to be more effective than talking about numbing that pain. Or if a client spoke about feeling trapped when talking about a specific situation, then the therapist can talk about finding a way out, escaping, or some other trapped related solution. They can tell metaphors or stories about someone that is trapped and escapes. And this would be more helpful than perhaps telling metaphors or stories about gaining a new perspective or some other solution. As mentioned around commands and suggestions, metaphors are a great way of packaging suggestions and ideas. Some of this packaging, as mentioned, can be metaphorically laying down patterns, like telling a story of someone walking through a forest and then coming to a mountain and noticing there's a cave high up in the side of the mountain. And so climbing and struggling up to that mountain to get to the cave, and then looking out from the cave and getting a new perspective on the forest below, can lay down a helpful pattern for undergoing therapy to get to a place where the client can look back and have a new perspective on the problem. And this metaphor can be carried forward to having other answers and solutions. The therapist can tell a story and embed suggestions within the metaphor. Below is an example of a story of Snow White that was told to a team of staff in a care home. So this is a story I told in a team meeting to all the staff. The staff had begun to experience splitting, where staff that worked on different shifts began criticizing staff on other shifts and blaming each other for things, and had stopped working as a cohesive team. This story was told during a team day, during a relaxation session, to suggest the idea of working together as a team again. And this is what I told during that session. One day, Snow White decided that she wanted to go on a walk. She didn't often go out far from her home, as she was unsure what she would find in the deep, dark forest. Snow White left on a path right outside her front door. The path was covered by trees arching high overhead. Either side of her was deep, dark forest. Snow White stuck to the path, walking through the shimmering beams of light that flickered down through the trees above. As she continued to follow this path, she was aware of the rhythmic beat of her feet on the ground, and the sounds of birds in the trees, and the rustling of the leaves as the wind blew a breeze. She continued to wander, and at times found her mind wonder about why she set out on this journey. After walking for a while, she found herself smile as she saw a house in the distance. The house was in a clearing in the forest that was bright and cheerful. There were plants of many varieties and many flowers surrounding the house. As Snow White reached the clearing, she could feel the calm warmth from the sun on her skin. Snow White could hear voices coming from the house, and the closer she got, the more she could tell that the people inside the house were disagreeing with each other. Snow White approached and asked one of the people what was wrong. Grumpy explained that they used to all go to work singing and dancing with enjoyment, but now they seem to have forgotten how to work as a team. Grumpy explained that they used to push together, pull together, act together, all together. But now they found they couldn't. When one pushed, another pulled, and no work got done. Snow White asked what they do, and was told that they're a team that digs and lays the foundations for new buildings. She asked them why they decided to do that work. She was told that you see buildings standing and feel proud because you know that they're standing because you built the foundations well. It makes you proud of all the hard work you did. Snow White decided to tell the little people a story about a centipede that kept falling over its legs. The centipede asked a friend how he managed to walk without falling over. He was told to just relax and let all the legs work together, not keep thinking about which leg should do what and when. This made no sense to the dwarves, so they decided to forget what Snow White said and just enjoy her company. Before Snow White left, she asked who made such a lovely garden. The dwarves said that they all worked at it, and that many of the plants have survived some harsh winters. At the end of the day, Snow White said goodbye to the dwarves. She got right up and left. As she left, she was amazed by how much happier and healthier they were starting to become. Something had happened that they were learning from, which looked like it made them healthier, made them work out their differences. Sneezy had stopped sneezing, Grumpy was happy, Bashful had clear skin and no hint of red, and all the others had noticed improvements too. This made Snow White happy as she skipped away from the house, up the path, leaving her adventure behind like a dream that got more out of reach, like a name on the tip of your tongue, as she approached her home, pleased with her mini adventure, then walked through her gate, and finding it was all a dream, she opened her eyes. As you can see, the character Snow White is me turning up to talk with all the staff, and in this story, it starts talking about a journey and engaging the listeners in following the journey. As it continues, it involves a home of dwarves mirroring the care home. There are embedded commands for working together. The care home was for teenagers. So the dwarves talk about what their job is, which is to lay foundations for new buildings, mirroring the care home staff job of helping the teenagers develop the skills they need for adult life. There's a metaphor in a metaphor, with Snow White talking about the centipede. This metaphor lays down the idea of working together, without thinking about it and without effort. As the story approaches the end, Snow White comments on the garden, which all the dwarves have helped to make nice. This is used as a way of knowing that there are strengths there, and there are times that the staff will have worked together successfully. They perhaps just need reminding of those times and need the pattern for going back to working like that again reignited. At the same time, it is an opportunity to mention being able to continue to work together successfully even when things get tough. Then the story ends with the idea of inducing conscious amnesia by talking about the experience of it being like a dream or something on the tip of your tongue. I don't directly say forget this story, as this is one quick way of making people remember it. I wanted the staff to forget the story so that they wouldn't analyze and sabotage the ideas in the story. I wanted them to make positive changes non-consciously. The story also ends with a description of some of the dwarves and how they're following things and how they are following things, improving, and I linked specific individuals and traits with specific dwarves. I did wonder whether anyone would notice what I was talking about, but no one seemed to notice. One of the staff had allergies, so I had Sneezy, stopping sneezing. One member of staff was known to generally be grumpy and complaining, even when everyone got on well. So I had Grumpy, get happy. And one person had eczema, so I had Bashful, not being red-faced. I wanted to add something that let everyone non-consciously know that this whole story had been about them. I didn't want them to pay attention to that consciously, though. The story wasn't told straight away. As mentioned, it was during a relaxation session, so I'd been talking for a while, guiding the staff into a relaxed place before telling the story, but ended the experience with the end of the story. Having had that period of relaxation first helped to stop people being likely to analyze what I was saying, and so less likely to think he's talking about me there or he's talking about them there. Tasks that are given to clients can also be metaphorical. So an alcoholic could be asked to look after some cacti as a way of teaching them about surviving without alcohol. Or someone with depression could be asked to find a stone on the beach, carry it around with them for a few weeks before revisiting the beach and throwing the stone into the sea, as a way of teaching them about carrying around an uncomfortable problem and then deciding to let it go. So that was the final language pattern. Next is Paradoxical Interventions. Let's just see if there's any questions here or comments. Cheese, I see the word cheese. Stop hitting yourself. Stop hitting yourself. That's all I'm seeing now. There's multiple reasons where it's definitely not any kind of holy grail of hypnosis. There's multiple reasons for arm levitation. One is that it is a very good convincer. If someone is, say, raising their arm and they didn't expect to, that really draws your attention in and makes you think, oh wow, my arm's moving, and so now you're even deeper absorbed in the experience. A lot of hypnotists never really did this because it's an active process. It takes effort to lift an arm. It takes no effort to relax deeply and fully and become essentially loose and limp as a body. So most hypnotists will go for the loose and limp type thing. But Milton Erickson used to do arm levitations, which used to confuse people because people used to think everyone else is doing hypnotic inductions where they relax someone, and you're there making people do something that involves tension of muscles to actually raise an arm. And his thing was that it's because they're putting in work to do that. So I'm having someone put in work, and I want them in therapy to be putting in work. So that was one of his reasons, was that for someone to do an arm levitation, they're putting in actual work in that moment during the therapy session, and he wants them to be putting in work in relation to the therapy. So having them doing work kind of almost primes and triggers the kind of the response for actively doing something, which is what you want in therapy, people to actively be doing something. But you can also link it to things. So you can do, for example, an arm levitation, then say things like, and as that arm lowers down, you can go deeper into hypnosis, or as that arm lowers down, so you can make all the necessary changes around that problem. And you link solving the problem with the arm lowering. And if someone's arm is up, there's only one way it's going to go. And the question ends up being, how quickly is it going to lower? So because their arm is now up, you link success of therapy with the arm lowering down. And it's very hard for them to resist that therapy, because to resist the sort of doing the therapy, they would have to keep their arm up. And they're not going to keep their arm up. So at some point, they're going to have to start lowering their arm. So it's quite a good way of channeling any resistance into them trying to keep the arm up as long as they can. And then eventually that resistance runs out and their arm starts lowering, and that's fine. Some people will lower their arm too quickly. So you can tell them, don't make those inner changes too fast. Let that arm slow down. So you can link change with what's going on with the arm. So it's more just a case of, it's something that's visual. It's something the hypnotist can see happening, or else people just sit there not moving. It's something a hypnotist can see happening. So you can see, is this person responding? It's definitely an experience that people remember and think, wow, that was, and it's a non-threatening experience. So you're not making someone like do a stage show type act, which they might think that's embarrassing, or I feel manipulated or whatever. But they can notice, oh, my arm lifted on its own and I didn't do that. So it's a good convincer. It's something the hypnotist can watch happen as well. So it will let the hypnotist know, is this person responding? Because you can see whether they're responding, because their arm will either move or it won't. So you can then make a judgment. Whereas if you look at someone and think, are they responding to my suggestion that they visualize something? You've got no knowledge unless you ask them a question like, can you see that in your mind? You don't know if they're doing what, they could be in their mind, I don't know, singing a song for all you know. So it just gives you an idea of whether someone's following along. So there are lots of advantages to it. It doesn't mean you use it all the time. And I would say that generally you probably don't use arm levitation. I'm more likely to use arm levitation on training courses where you're trying to convince an audience that the person is responding, because what the person is responding by is things like the fact that the way their eyes have moved. But someone sitting a number of rows back will think, well, I couldn't see that. So to me, they just look like they were sat there with their eyes closed, and they opened their eyes and said, yep, lovely experience, and have moved on. You could do smacking themselves in the face. There's a video of me hypnotizing Graham. This is a very long time ago. And I did a handshake induction on Graham, and then did, so it was a Richard Bandler style handshake induction. So it was, hi, I'm Dan. And then Graham puts his hand out to shake my hand. And then I take his hand, hold it up in front of his face and say, look at that spot there and notice how, as that hand moves closer to your face, your eyes defocus. And as your eyes defocus and that hand moves on its own to your face, you can go deeper and deeper into hypnosis. So I've interrupted the pattern, and now I'm doing this deepener with the hand coming to his face. But as soon as it went to there and touched his face, I literally just burst out laughing, because all I could think in my head was that I wanted to go on his hand and kind of have his hand smack on his face. And that thought went through my head. And so I Graham's there taking it all seriously and kind of, and then his hand gets to his face and I just crease up laughing uncontrollably. And then that makes Graham crease up laughing uncontrollably. And then there's Graham, myself on the video. There's Graham, myself, then thinking, me trying to take this seriously as well, and Graham laughing, and then Graham saying, should we just try something else? And I'm saying, no, we're going to do this. I made myself laugh. Ignore that. We'll carry on. And Graham then going, go, just get on with it. Come on, just try it. Do it again. But yeah, so. Well, what you could do is take a photo of yourself with the cauliflower slapped all over your face, cauliflower cheese slapped all over your face, where you're trying to lick the spoon with your eyes closed. What is cauliflower cheese? Cauliflower and cheese. Well, cheese sauce. It's quite, I like the texture of it. It's something that I can eat lots of. Dan in a Snow White dress. Yes, I don't have that yet. Just reading down quickly before I can move on to the next brief chapter. The next chapter is brief. Yeah, when you toss the stone back in the ocean, make sure that you don't hit someone else in the head with it and think, oh, I quite liked hitting that person in the head with that stone. They've been annoying me for weeks. Every time I come to the beach, they're stood there. Yep, it was successful. Over the sort of following weeks, even, they started working together. Yeah, Graham was very much a guinea pig of mine for lots and lots of different things. And I would agree. If you're not happy being a hypnotic guinea pig, then you're not really worth being a friend. It's not scary being my friend. You've spent more time with me here than any friend has probably spent with me for the last probably 2 decades. Yes. So I want to see these photos of you hypnotizing a guinea pig. Like going into a pet shop or something. Not that you can do that right now, but going into a pet shop and hypnotizing all the guinea pigs. Yeah, I think people around me mute me. They kind of go into their heads and go into like elevator music in their heads. And I just carry on talking at them. Some of them say to me, I got bored a long time ago and haven't been paying any attention to you. Nowadays that my observation skills are a bit better, I say, yes, I was aware of that, but I didn't care. I hadn't finished saying what I wanted to say, and I'm saying what I want to say for me, not for you. Yeah, all at once. I want to see a line of guinea pigs, and then on the count of 3, you click your fingers, and they all just fall to their side or something. Yep, you can hypnotize animals. Hypnotizing cats and dogs is relatively straightforward. Just even using just breathing and blinking, you can end up matching it's quite amusing, matching like a cat's blinking. And then when you close your eyes, the cat keeps closing their eyes, and they just end up falling into rapport with you. And then you end up closing your eyes and kind of sneaking an eye open and seeing they haven't opened their eyes again. They've just left their eyes shut and zonked out. Um, um, Make therapeutic changes. Um, you make your cat yawn. So let me just talk about paradoxical interventions. This is the second to last bit I'm reading. Within the Ericksonian approach, one thing that's often used are paradoxical interventions. This might also have some relevance to what you've just mentioned there as well. I can't remember what examples I've covered in this chapter. I find paradoxical interventions often develop naturally from applying the fundamental principles of an Ericksonian approach. I also don't think that they're usually very paradoxical, just logical. An intervention is paradoxical when it seems like the opposite thing to do, or an unusual thing to do, that for most people perhaps doesn't seem like it would work. Like suggesting to an alcoholic to drink alcohol, or an insomniac to stay awake, or a teenager that's refusing to go to bed to stay awake as late as they can. I've used paradoxical interventions frequently with people. Here are some examples where I've used paradoxical interventions successfully. I worked with an alcoholic whose pattern was to go to buy 3 bottles of vodka, take them home to his flat and drink them until he passed out, then repeat this process when he had sobered up enough to go to the shop to get more, normally the next day. I had 2 sessions with him where he took no notice of anything, He had no intention of changing, yet his father had asked me to help him as he didn't know what to do. The man didn't ask for help himself. It's easier to encourage someone who doesn't want to stop doing something to agree to do more of it. So this is what I suggested. I told him that he obviously wanted to keep drinking and wanted to keep seeing me so that his father wouldn't kick him out of his flat. His father owned the flat. Due to his drinking, the man, who used to work as a lawyer, was unemployed. But I'm not going to waste my time seeing him if he isn't prepared to work with me. I said I also didn't want his father to think that this was a waste of time. So would he agree to do some drinking that will let him explore his issues with drinking and learn something, and at the same time he can tell his father that I told him to do it as an experiment? He agreed. I told him what I want him to do was, when he felt he needed a drink, to go to the pub, which was closer than going to the shops where he normally purchases vodka, order 3 pints of beer, line them up in front of him, and gulp back the first one and then say, "Effing therapist making me drink this beer." Then gulp back the second and third pints, doing the same. Then go home. If he still wanted to drink more, he can go back to the pub and do the same again. He did this and stopped drinking on his own a few weeks later. And I've done this type of intervention on a few occasions with alcoholics that drink alone at home and ones that don't drink beer. I worked with a smoker that was referred to me by the NHS Quit Smoking Clinic. He came in and said, "I'm going to tell you what I told the lady that ran the clinic. I'll have you smoking 50 a day before you can stop me smoking 50 a day." He didn't come across as very motivated to quit. He knew all the reasons that he'd been told he should quit, but said he didn't want to, but he would see me, and then he can tell everyone how he tried everything. I saw him for a first session. By the second session, he stuck to his word of ignoring everything and wanted to stay smoking. So again, I told him I wanted him to try an experiment, just so that I know a bit more about his habit, and that I would involve him that it would involve him continuing to smoke at least the same amount as he does currently. He agreed he would do what I asked. One of his patterns that happened every few days was that he drove to a supermarket to get food shopping. He didn't go to the nearest supermarket because he had to have a fixed number of cigarettes. He would have one when he got into his car, two on the journey, and two in the supermarket car park because he knew he couldn't smoke once he was in the supermarket. So he had to have extra before going in there. I told him what I wanted him to do was to wait until he got into the car park and then smoke all 5 cigarettes and one more because he had to wait so long before having any. He enthusiastically agreed to do this, thinking it sounded easy. He cancelled his next appointment. I bumped into him in town a few months later. He'd said that he was really angry with me. He did as I asked, but he found that sitting in the car when he had shopping to do and having to smoke 6 cigarettes really annoyed him. All he wanted to do was get into the shop, get his food, and go. But he was stuck outside the shop, still smoking. He was resenting the cigarettes. He ended up deciding not to smoke in his car because of this. This then spread to forgetting to smoke after he was home, out of his car, and over a few weeks, he was regularly forgetting to smoke. And at the point I saw him, he rarely smoked. Prescribing the symptom. One of the most commonly used paradoxical interventions is prescribing the symptom. Often therapists try to encourage clients to stop their symptoms, but even things we don't really like are difficult at times to let go of when we do them instinctively or they serve a purpose. It's much easier to get someone to agree to do something they already do than to try and get them to do something entirely new. If someone has a habit of biting their nails, perhaps it can be suggested that they bite their nails more, or in a different order, or at a different speed. If someone smokes, perhaps they can be suggested to smoke more, or in a different way. I think of it as being like chaos therapy. What the therapist is doing is finding a way to insert a small change that the client will accept into the pattern of the problem. And using this as a starting point, this creates a snowballing effect. What the therapist is doing is focusing on how they can change the pattern of the problem in some way so that a new pattern can take over. They just need to find that one thing which will unravel the problem, and something which is such a small or simple thing that the client will have no problem taking it on board and making that small change. For example, cravings only last a few minutes. Even at the time of a craving, even if at the time of a craving it can seem like it's going to last or feel like it does last for ages. Cravings also aren't usually as bad as they feel. It's just that there's nothing to compare the severity of it to. If a smoker compares a craving to the experience of a bad toothache, they would usually agree that they would prefer a few minutes of a craving. Without this comparison, they may say that they would virtually kill for a cigarette when a craving strikes. Because a craving doesn't last long in reality, if it's suggested to a smoker that when they get a craving, would they be prepared to do relaxing breathing for 1 minute? And if they still want a cigarette after that, then they can have the cigarette. Most smokers are happy to do this. It's easy to do, but it can have a big impact on their smoking habit. Most people say one of the reasons they smoke is to relax, yet nicotine is a stimulant. It's the deep breathing smokers do and taking a break which helps them relax. So when they do that minute of relaxing breathing, they can end up no longer needing a cigarette. They're also giving themselves some time so the craving may pass. Something else could occur which distracts them and they forget to have the cigarette. So this one small change could disrupt their pattern and lead to them quitting smoking without any willpower or effort. If someone's depressed and sits down doing nothing at home, maybe they can be encouraged to be depressed and sit down in a library doing nothing, with a book of interest in front of them, open, even if they don't read it, just so that it looks like they're reading. If they're able to do this and agree to do this, they don't realize that the therapist has just increased the chances that someone will end up eventually striking up a conversation with them, perhaps about the book. And this conversation may be the beginning of socializing more again and focusing externally on other things rather than worries or negative thoughts, and of getting their innate needs met. The question is, what can be altered about the pattern that may seem insignificant or irrelevant to the client, but which is something they're likely to agree to do that is likely to lead to a positive change in the future? This could be changing the frequency of the problem, the duration of the problem, the order the problem happens in, the location of the problem, adding in an extra element to the problem, or using the problem for something else. Problems can be made into chores, like having someone that can't sleep agree to thoroughly clean their house all night long if they're still awake 15 minutes after going to bed. There are many different ways of intervening, seemingly paradoxically. In the book on therapeutic transformation, I'll focus on different therapeutic approaches to helping people overcome their problems, including more on paradoxical interventions. The next bit is the final bit, but let me just look up and see if there's any comments here. Yes, so the idea of the effing therapist making me drink this beer was to try and, give some kind of a focus and channel any annoyance and all that sort of stuff at me as the therapist, and at this being my fault. And also it does make it a bit more fun for them. It makes them laugh when you tell them to do it, which again makes them think, yeah, I'm happy to do that. It makes me laugh. Um, well, he only had to carry it out the once for it to completely disrupt. So his first trip to the supermarket, he does that and ends up resenting the cigarettes. And by the time he realized it was changing his behaviors, it was changing his behaviors. Um, so at first you're just kind of like getting a bit irritated with it, and then you end up like thinking, oh. And the other one is you do just want some kind of engagement. If he didn't engage, if he just smoked 2 cigarettes, for example, and thought, oh, forget this, there's no way I'm sitting outside the supermarket smoking the rest. But he was stubborn. He was someone who had come in saying, I will have you smoking 50 a day before you can stop me smoking 50 a day. So he was expressing how stubborn he was about things. So I was reasonably confident that he'd probably be very stubborn at, I'm not going to, I'm not going to not do this because I'm stubborn and I've said I'm going to, and I can't let a therapist beat me by me not doing what I've been told, kind of thing. And obviously, it's always good if someone's mad at you in therapy, I think. Yeah, I get very surprised that when you learn about smoking as a therapist and when you attend drug and alcohol courses and all the rest of it, which obviously in all the work I've done, as well as learning about it in terms of training um, as a therapist, I've learned about it in terms of attending drug and alcohol training for all my other work that I've done. And they always tell you, cigarettes are a stimulant, and they talk about the fact that the sort of nicotine makes you sort of more hyper and everything, makes you more alert, and that it doesn't relax you at all. And then they talk about the fact that what ends up, smokers regularly report that they're relaxed, but what ends up relaxing people is actually the fact that they're doing deep breathing while they're smoking. So it gets taught to the professionals, and for whatever reason, professionals never seem to then share it with clients. They'll tell clients all the, don't smoke because, and then they'll tell clients all the like negatives and stuff. But they kind of, I think maybe therapists think that that's a positive that might make clients stay smoking, rather than seeing it as, oh, so if I say I smoke because I want to relax, then what you're telling me is that something I do while smoking, I can do without smoking, and that will relax me. And it just seems illogical that therapists get taught it and they don't then seem to hand it over, that knowledge over to the clients. Um, yes, obviously, as I've constantly pointed out, all these examples are, um, you have to do these with the right client. So it is a very kind of established strategy that if someone's, say, depressed at home, you see if you can encourage them to be depressed, say, in a library where they've got a book in front of them, and that way it encourages. So say they were depressed at home, but their big issue is they're not socializing. That's part of their unmet emotional needs. They don't feel any sense of maybe status and whatever other needs are not being met, but they wouldn't go out their way to strike up conversations and things. You see, can you put someone into a situation where someone else strikes up the conversation instead of them? The same with people who struggle with meeting people, etc. If someone says, I'm terrible at like me, I am terrible at starting conversations. I can go to a networking event and leave that networking event having never ever spoken to a single person at that networking event. But if others strike up the conversation with me, I can respond to that conversation that started up. So a way of working with me, if someone observed that my need wasn't being met, I'm saying, like, I really wish I could engage with people, etc. To help me to learn how to engage with people could be to identify, if we put Dan in this kind of situation, it seems harmless, but inevitably from time to time, someone's going to strike up a conversation with Dan instead of Dan striking up a conversation with them. And that will begin to teach him to be able to have these conversations with people. So that could be something someone could do with me, knowing that if I need to improve my communication skills, I wouldn't go out of my way to do it. I wouldn't go out of my way to walk up to people and start conversations with people. So the therapeutic way of handling that is, can we make it so that there's situations that occur where others go to Dan, but in a way that is kind of not so common and doesn't happen so often that he feels uncomfortable, like everyone keeps talking to me. But he's just kind of there, and then from time to time someone says, you're reading that, that's a really interesting book, that is. I remember when I read that, and then a conversation starts up or something. So it is, obviously, all of this is always client dependent. There'll always be someone who will say that wouldn't work for me, or that wouldn't work for so and so who I know because of this, that, or the other. And that would be correct. It probably won't work for those people because it's not for those people. It's for the people who it's right for. Like the smoking cigarettes when you're in a car park is only going to work for the right person. The person has to be willing to engage with the task that was set. They have to be willing to follow that, even when it's annoying them. And you're kind of hoping that on some level it's going to annoy them, because that's the whole point. You want them to think, oh God, I just got to get through these cigarettes. This is really annoying me now. I just want to get my shopping over and done with. So you want it to be the kind of person who doesn't enjoy shopping particularly, who sees it as a chore, sees it as something they just have to do, something they don't really enjoy. They just want to get in, do it, leave. And someone who perhaps is going to be stubborn, who's going to stick to what they've said, no matter what, even if everyone's trying to make them do something different. If someone's got that kind of mindset, then they end up sticking to it because that's exactly what you want them to be doing. You wouldn't necessarily prescribe the symptom if it's not relevant. So obviously not everything is, like with everything, not everything is relevant for everything. So prescribing the symptom may not be relevant for someone. So like the personal hygiene thing, a time that prescribing the symptom could help could be if, by telling someone not to wash at certain times, for example, could put them in a situation where someone who they ordinarily would have washed for, like, say, I don't know, a teenage lad who has got a girlfriend, and they will wash on the day of the week when they go and see the girlfriend, but they don't wash pretty much any other time. Get them to agree not to wash, and then have the girlfriend telling them that they stink or something. Obviously, this is hypothetical and assuming that this is what you've established would end up be likely to happen, could end up being the thing that then makes them start washing all the time, because they hated that kind of the girlfriend telling them or something. Whereas normally it's not the girlfriend telling them, it's normally a parent or something telling them, and they couldn't care less what the parent says. It's just, how do you then get the right person to tell them? So prescribing the symptom obviously isn't always the answer. It's just one of many different things that you could do. And like everything, you don't always use a hammer for every single job. You don't sort of think, oh, that screw needs screwing in, let's get the hammer out. Oh, that hole needs fixing, let's get the hammer out. There's specific jobs that hammers are useful for. So not everything is helpful for everything, but and likewise, someone not doing assignments, it could be that with someone, maybe there's something about them not doing the assignments that make it so that doing something, intentionally not doing the assignment ends up being something they really desperately want to do. But you'd have to establish that that is the case. You wouldn't just do it because it's like, I've got to do prescribing the symptom with someone. You do it because it's the right thing to do in that situation with that person at that time. It's not about anyone else or anything else. It's just right for them right there. And not everything is going to necessarily, it could be that if a real client came in and wasn't doing their assignments, something about the way that client presents or what that client says makes me think, I think I'm going to recommend that you don't do your assignments. But there's got to be some logical reason why I've come to that conclusion through my observations, and that I'm utilizing their motivation not to do it. So it could be that, for example, you could have agreed with the school or the college or whatever that you want them to be able to get their assignment in by a later date because you're going to be doing some therapy to see if you can help them to do this. And then, you're all working together as professionals. And so maybe you then tell them not to do it, and then have, say, a parent who's trying to get them to do other things. And then the one thing they're not doing, that they now aren't even using as an excuse, they can't even say, well, I've got my assignment to do. Sorry, mum, can't help you with that. They've been told, don't do your assignment right now. Whatever you do, just don't do it. So it could be that there is somehow a context for someone that that's the case. I know that there have been people who for not eating, who have ended up having the assignment as the prescribing the symptom of not eating. So there's even a case of Milton Erickson where the place that he was working in, the sort of hospital thing he was working in at the time, would try and force feed people food. They put the tube down the person's throat and have liquidized food forced into the person's stomach to make sure that they ate against their will. And Erickson came along and said, don't do that. If they don't want to eat, just don't let them eat. And would then make sure everyone else was getting fed, and would constantly emphasize, oh no, they don't want to eat. They've made it clear they don't want to eat. They don't want us to give them any food. So, we're respecting that. We're not going to give them any food. But obviously then the person, and as I say, this is always specific to that one individual. This isn't about generalizing it to to everyone else or anyone else. It's about that one individual and how you think that one person will respond to the therapy. And so that one individual's response was, hang on, it's your job to feed me. It's your job has been to try and make sure that I eat. Your job has been to force that into me, even though I'm refusing and I'm arguing with you and I'm telling you I don't want it. That's your job. You're being neglectful if you don't give me the food. Why are you not giving me the food? Well, because we're respecting your opinions. we respect that you say you don't want us to feed you, so we're allowing you not to have the food. And so the person's then arguing, saying, but you need to be giving me the food. That's your job. Your job as healthcare professionals is to not do any harm and to make sure you're giving me the food that I need to live. And they were then fighting for the right that they should have the food given to them, to the point where then they're accepting it when it was given to them. Yeah, when Milton Erickson was overruled essentially with other stuff on purpose. This was all part of the whole strategy, that he's overruled. Like, okay, he's saying not to, but if you really want us to, look, we'll give you some bits, but just don't let Milton, don't let Dr. Erickson know. And so then it's like, okay, I'll have this food, but I promise I won't let Dr. Erickson know. So it was about trying to change the person's relationship with the food, but by using the way they'd been responding to what was happening as a way of kind of essentially prescribing the symptom of, you're not going to be allowed to eat it, so because you don't want to, so there's no need for it, kind of thing. That wouldn't necessarily work with everyone, and it was only for that was what the treatment was felt to be for that one individual, for their mindset, for their way of processing things, for their way of thinking about things. And that's obviously the important point with all of this is, and obviously this is an important point for everything to do with therapy. And when you read books and things, it's very common for someone to say, right, so what should I do to treat this problem? And it's never as simple as that. When I see questions saying things like, what can I do to treat this? Well, I don't know, because who is the client? What has happened in the therapy up to this point? What's their background? What's their way of processing the world? What's the way they're approaching this problem? What is it that's right for them as an individual? What's all the other information that I don't have outside of that one small sentence? There's lots of ways you can approach it, but there could also be ways that just from a sentence that I don't even think of suggesting, but if I worked with the person, I would naturally think, oh, I'd probably do this. And this is the problem that therapists sometimes fall into, that therapists will suggest, I think you need to do X, Y, and Z to clients. And clients will often, I tried that, didn't work. Tried that, didn't work. So when therapists get into the habit of essentially kind of suggesting therapy, telling people how to get better, it's nearly always met with people pointing out they've already been there and done that and it didn't work. Think of something else, doctor. And it just ends up kind of in a battle of wills almost, rather than it being an organic kind of, you're the client, what's right for you, I'm here just to support you on your journey, you're the one that does your therapy, I don't do your therapy for you, you do your therapy, I just support you on your journey through the therapy. You're actually doing it and going on that journey, just like someone's running a marathon, you might go alongside them on a bike, cheering them on, motivating them, keeping them on track when you see them starting to slow down a bit and think, oh, this feels like it's so far. You might then motivate them and spur them on and say, you're nearly there, you've made it over halfway now, you're doing so well. And so you're encouraging them, and that is what a therapist is there for. A therapist isn't there to do the therapy, a therapist is there to keep the client on track. But what you do offer and do to encourage them to stay on track and to start taking the steps they need to take is perhaps setting tasks and all these different things that we've been talking about. Yes, I don't remember specifically since I enjoy annoying people. That's not your words. But I do feel that I'm doing something right if people end up annoyed with me because they've started getting better despite all that. What I find is with most addictions, it's normally about some emotional need not being met or other, frequently connection not being met. So, for example, back during Vietnam, the US panicked because a vast number of troops had become addicted, I think it was to cocaine, and they were worried, or were using cocaine, and they were worried that because of it being highly addictive, that all these troops were going to come back to the US with a cocaine problem. And so they end up following all these troops, thinking, oh my god, they're all going to come back, they're all going to have this problem. But once they came back to the US, a very, very, very small percentage of them carried on using drugs. Nearly all of them just went back to normal life. As soon as all their emotional needs, innate needs, were being met again, and they had control over their lives, they had a sense of meaning and purpose back in their lives, they had connection to others in their lives, they had all these different needs being met. Once they were back in a situation like that, they just didn't do the drugs. They didn't get any craving to do them. They just came back and got on with life. And the government were kind of surprised by this, because they imagined that they would all come back, and potentially, if they couldn't get hold of the drugs, they would end up getting cravings and then trying to get hold of them, what have you. The only ones that carried on doing the drugs were those who perhaps had developed post-traumatic stress disorder, or came back and they literally had no life left to come back to. So they had their needs carried on not being met when they arrived back in the US. And they were the ones who ended up carrying on having problems. Everyone who came back and when they arrived back were getting their needs met, didn't have the drug problem ended. It was only the ones who carried on having it. So, and that's what I've always kind of found, that the big thing has been, and usually connection in some way. That the big thing has been that people aren't getting their needs fully met, and so the drug then meets certain needs. And if you can help them to get their needs met again, then by healthy things, then they end up not having to try to stop the drugs. They just don't need the drugs. It just that need is being met elsewhere. It doesn't mean that, if the drug was offered to them, they wouldn't kind of think, oh, okay, I'll have some. It just means they're not addicted to it. It's more a kind of take it or leave it kind of thing. Yeah, ideally you do want people. What was found was that, even though, so going back to the Erickson example with the force feeding the food thing, the people with eating disorders who are being force fed food in that way, um, they didn't gain any weight. So technically, their bodies still kind of seem to reject the calories, even though it's being forced, into them, kind of high calorie um, liquid, essentially. They just still didn't gain weight. So force feeding people, not only is it traumatic for the person, disrespectful essentially for the person, not necessarily long term therapeutic in terms of, yes, you might manage to force feed them enough to keep them alive for now, but is it making them think, oh, this is great, this is, maybe I should start eating differently? Is what is the therapeutic part of this, that what is the bit that makes them feel good about themselves, or whatever is needed in relation to them progressing from this situation they're finding themselves in. Whereas if someone can end up eating on their own, then obviously that's clearly going to be a much better thing. And if they can come to that decision themselves as well, so rather than kind of being told, yeah. So I generally don't think it probably works. But then I'm also not a fan generally. I'm not saying that I can't that there's never a situation where I might think, oh, actually, in that one situation, that is that is kind of an idea that would work for that one individual in that one situation. But generally, I can't think of something off the top of my head where kind of being aggressive in terms of like forcing someone, invading someone's privacy, like forcing someone to eat, or forcing a child to be locked in a room so that they fall asleep, or any of these sort of interventions. I can't see any situation where that would be the first kind of choice on how you're going to help someone. There are so much better options normally out there that you could take that may require more patience and slightly longer term to get the ball rolling, but in the long run are more likely to create lasting change. But yes, so the last bit in here is how to craft healing stories. And then next time, obviously, I'm on to the therapy session that I transcribed. One of my favorite ways of working is through the use of healing stories. As has been mentioned in the chapter about metaphors, when working with clients to help them overcome their problems or to achieve success, what the therapist is working with are the patterns for the problem, not the content of the problem. Using stories allows the client to do therapy in their own way. It's a very client-centered way of working. All the therapist is doing is presenting the patterns for the problem and solution, but leaving the client to find their own solutions. The therapist isn't dictating how the client should get better. Stories lay down, update, and stimulate the client's neurological patterns. They allow the client to view their problem as an observing self, from an observing self position, rather than from within the problem. It's like rising up above a forest to see where you are and where you can go, compared to being in the middle of a forest and only seeing dense trees. Stories help to make something more memorable. If I present something like a story about not seeing the wood for the trees, that will be more memorable than if I just say that people sometimes only see the problem from within the problem. What's helpful is for them to be able to get a different perspective on the problem. If I tell a client a story about someone struggling up a mountain, having different and interesting experiences during the journey up the mountain, perhaps defeating a dragon to make it to the top of the mountain, and then looking out from the top of the mountain over the land and seeing how far they've come and how they've overcome various challenges, this will be impactful and memorable. To tell an effective healing story, the therapist needs to engage all the senses. They need to be absorbing attention, which is essentially then hypnotizing the client, giving greater access to the inner potential of the client. Ideally, stories will be based on things that the client has communicated. So if they said that their problem was like being stuck in a rut, then the therapist may create a story around the idea, meaning that the story resonates with the client, like having shared language and seems familiar to them. They also then understand on some level that the story is to do with their issue because the therapist is using metaphors and content they gave to describe the issue and challenges that they're facing. If the client has commented about feeling stuck in a rut, the therapist may talk about someone getting their car stuck on a mud track or a country road late at night in the pouring rain and struggling to get the car out of the rut. They would tell a story which would resolve the issue and get the car out of the rut. And this pattern would, and this pattern which was shared could then be applied to the presenting problem by the client to help them overcome the issue. The client may not do this with conscious awareness. It could be that they just find they start doing things differently in some way because the metaphors come from the client and the client doesn't have anything directly told to them about what they must do. Storytelling can bypass client resistance. It's hard to resist something when there's nothing being told to you to resist. As has been mentioned many times in this book and the first Hypnotherapy Revealed book, Introduction to Hypnotherapy, the brain works like a pattern matching machine. And dreaming brain processes are largely like learning brain processes. Stories resonate well with how the brain works. In Introduction to Hypnotherapy, I shared about the brain doing sloppy pattern matching and how this happens in a metaphorical way. This makes storytelling an obvious choice for a therapist to use in therapy because the therapist can present ideas metaphorically, and the brain of the client will observe the pattern. Often, what goes on consciously is very analytical, trying to understand things, and usually looking at the surface details and content to find meaning. This isn't the same for everyone, but for many. Whereas non-consciously, they'll be perceiving the underlying pattern or structure rather than the overlaying content. Storytelling has been used throughout history to help people through life transitions, to educate, to share moral teachings, and to make information more memorable. Prior to written texts, information had to be conveyed orally. It's easier to remember and share stories than cold information. Stories offer a dissociated, non-judgmental look at problems and how clients and allow clients to look at the pattern of the problem and solution from an emotion and content-free perspective. This doesn't mean that the stories are emotion-free, but what the client doesn't have is the emotional clouding which can happen when someone is absorbed in the problem. There may be emotion in the story which mirror or have some relevance to the problem, but they're part of the story and can be perceived in a way that is therapeutic for the client, whether associated or disassociated. The story has content, but it's free of the content of the problem. One of the most common questions I get asked is, where do I find my metaphors to create stories around, and how do I know what to talk about? I touched on this in the chapter on metaphors. I get most of my metaphors from the client. I have other ideas which I just like and frequently use as part of the types of stories I like creating, like using nature, but most of what I talk about in my therapeutic stories come from what the client has said. If a client talks about a rut, then I may create a story around this idea. If they gesture away from their face while talking about a problem, or mention needing to get distance from their problem, then I may create a story around the idea of gaining perspective. If, while talking, the client digs their heels into the ground, I may tell a story about someone digging their heels in. If they rub their neck while talking about a relationship, maybe they think their partner's a pain in the neck, so I might create a story around pain in the neck. Metaphors permeate every aspect of life. We use them almost continuously and often don't notice or realize that we're using metaphors or that others are using metaphors because they're so common. It's important to listen and observe for metaphors, especially getting used to common everyday metaphors, those phrases we hear all the time and overlook because everyone says them. These work well in therapy because we have a shared understanding of the metaphor. So I could create a story about a fat cat or fat cats for a client experiencing issues related to their employment and perhaps changes in their workplace. And this metaphor would likely be understood because they would understand about the metaphor of fat cats. The therapist should listen for words and phrases that clients use, and also the client's actions, like digging heels in when talking about something they didn't really want to change, or rubbing their neck when talking about their partner, or covering their eyes or closing their eyes when talking about something they don't want to face up to or see. Every client will have their own personal metaphors and will have their own personal interpretation or meaning for the metaphor to them. Sometimes problems themselves can be metaphors and then can be tackled by creating a story including the problem metaphor. For example, someone may present with a painful stiff shoulder while they have a cold shoulder, because perhaps there's a relationship issue somewhere in their life where someone is giving them a cold shoulder and not talking to them. Maybe they've developed tingling in an arm or hand that feels like something is crawling under their skin, and it turns out that something like a situation or person in their life makes their skin crawl, and they've turned this phrase into a real experience. These metaphors can all be used to create therapeutic stories. People may describe problems as burning, stabbing, sharp pain, need perspective, stuck in a rut, pain in the neck, feeling numb, and many more descriptions. The therapist will be observing for all of these and looking at how they can integrate those into the therapeutic story they develop. They can also integrate observations about the environment or things they know about the client, like hobbies, interests, skills, or life events, or anything else which may fit well into the story, making it more tailored and personal to that client. My therapeutic storytelling process begins by asking the client what they would like to achieve. I want to know what goal they want, not what they don't want, and perhaps a brief description of the problem in some instances. I listen and observe for metaphors and observe for the pattern of the client's situation. The content that they give may be helpful for metaphors and resources, which can be used to help the client, but the pattern being presented will give the information needed to help the client to move on from the problem. Once I have the pattern, I use this as the starting place for my story. This will be the structure which I'll build my story onto. Then I use the content, client metaphors, and my own ideas to build up a story around that pattern. I may also use ideas from the environment and what you know about the client. I do this in real time while talking with the client. I present the story by just asking the client to gaze off at something or to close their eyes, whatever is most comfortable for them. I take a few moments to help the client to relax, get comfortable and focused on me as a therapist. Then I present the story and metaphor while closely watching the client and their reaction so that I can judge pacing and wording and change what I'm doing and saying if needed. I don't pre-script anything. The client has given me all the information. All I'm doing is recalling what the client has communicated and linking it together into a therapeutic narrative. As I slowly and calmly tell my story, I talk about what the client can see, hear, feel, taste, smell in the story. I use a mix of vague and specific language. I'm vague when I don't know the specifics and specific when I do. If I want something specific in the story, then I introduce it before it is needed as something for the client to discover, and will carefully have them exploring to discover that thing I want them to have in their experience. Often, this would be perhaps a hut, or a stream, or a campfire, or tent, or a bridge, etc. I use association for experiences within the story, often to have the client try out certain behaviors, thoughts, or feelings, and disassociation for perspectives, where I want to have the client learn from the experience and gain perhaps new perspectives. Clients being associated during the story is often more of an emotional experience, whereas when they're disassociated, they often have more of an analytical observer experience. When a therapist is starting out, they're likely to be happy if they have been able to create one complete story. As the therapist becomes more experienced, they can start to create multi-layered stories and metaphors to repeat patterns in different ways, or to present multiple patterns and to encourage amnesia. They can do stories within stories, or just be telling a single story, but draw in different metaphors or ideas which all have the same underlying pattern, or perhaps all address different problem patterns. I frequently use dreaming, or a character in the story telling a story, or the main character having a flashback or flash forward as a way of introducing alternative stories or metaphors. When there are multiple metaphors or stories it is easier for someone to spontaneously develop amnesia about what took place in the middle of the experience. If a client was told a story which involved being out in the woods and they sat under a tree and started daydreaming and imagining what it would be like to be on Mars, what is told to the client while they're imagining being on Mars is harder to recall after they exit hypnosis, because it was sandwiched in the middle of the experience, and memory is state dependent. So when the person is in normal wakeful awareness, they're far removed from the deepest part of the story they were told. It doesn't mean that they'll have amnesia, but it will be similar to a dream. If they focus on it and keep thinking about it, then they'll be more likely to recall it. If the therapist moves on and doesn't ask them about the experience, then they'll find it more difficult to recall, especially as time passes. Once the therapist has completed their therapeutic story, they have to think about how they'll end the session. I simply tell the client that they can drift back to the room in their own time. I want the client to feel empowered at all times. I want them to know that this is their experience and they are in full control of the experience. There are different ways that the story itself can end. The story can end with a specific conclusion, or the ending could bring the story back to the beginning. I like to make sure that the client drifts back to the room, that the client drifting back to the room is contingent on them having made some therapeutic changes. I also generally don't encourage the client to analyze the story. If I think it would be helpful for them to analyze the story, then I may encourage it, but generally I don't want them trying to analyze what we've done and perhaps undo inner work which has been completed. To reduce the client spontaneously analyzing the story, I may talk about unrelated things or something I spoke to the client before therapy began to reorientate their attention away from the hypnotic experience. I may also set tasks for the client to do, which could include having the client do something connected with the story I told them that would then help to support the story and helping the client to make changes in their life. My biggest recommendation for those hoping to get more into healing storytelling is to start gathering stories in your mind, from books you read to films, anecdotes, and personal experiences. Learn different fairy tales and other short stories which have endured. Those which resonate with you will stick with you. Those that don't, which would need to be written down for you to remember them, they aren't stories for you. You want to be filling your mind with stories you like, which resonate with you, so that they come naturally to you when you share them. And then just practice telling therapeutic stories. So that's the end of my reading for today. Let me just scroll back, see if there's any comments here. Yes, I suddenly went through a yawning fit there. Yes, as far as possible, you do want to make sure everything's client-centered, client-focused, to use the client's own metaphors rather than imposing your own views on everyone. Okay, more focused on the yawning than the content. I must have non-consciously picked up that you were trying to count and then stopped yawning. Yep, you're blanking out or blacking out. I can have some water now. It did become very prevalent temporarily. Trust me, it's more annoying for me because my face is yawning and I'm thinking, no, my mouth needs to be moving to read words. I can't read and have my mouth wide open yawning at the same time. So obviously all of you know already that I like using storytelling therapeutically. And those last few chapters, in theory, have hopefully helped you to kind of see the stories, or when you think back about the stories, think of them as kind of what I'm doing in them and why perhaps I make certain transitions or do certain things. Like why I might have a character, yeah, have multiple story, essentially multiple metaphors inside an overarching story normally. And then the metaphors will cover different types of areas around stress, anxiety, and worry. That's what I focus on. Sometimes, if it's come up in the live chat, I've then also focused on pain or whatever else. Always in the moment. I've never planned stories beforehand. I've always kind of just made stories up on the spot. So there are times between sessions where, when you've got your notes that you've written, you kind of highlight things as, oh, there's, yeah, they'd mentioned this. I didn't end up using that, but that might end up being good for, maybe in a story or something. So you might highlight some bits and think, oh, the way they rub their hands together when they were talking about that, maybe that could crop up in a story somehow. And so you're just going through your notes, and so you kind of have some mental ideas of, from the last session, perhaps, of things that you just naturally, as part of your observations of the broader situation, you're aware might end up being helpful in a story. But yeah, I've never, obviously, when you learn to do therapy, generally you're learning to do therapy. So you don't go and kind of write out stories with clients or anything. You're doing therapy. The client is there in front of you, and you do your therapy. So yeah, so ever since I've done client work, any stories I've told, any actual therapy I've done. So as I mentioned before, the first kind of 18 months of seeing clients, when it got to it is now the hypnosis part, I had always been taught that you read scripts. So I would do all of the, what is it you'd like help with? How will you know when you're better? All those sort of things I would just naturally kind of do as part of what you're doing, not necessarily even because it was in training courses, because it normally wasn't. But because it would feel really uncomfortable if I did therapy, how my early hypnosis training courses were teaching me to do it. So, how my early training courses, which allegedly qualified me to be a hypnotherapist, but I definitely didn't feel, especially as I gained more knowledge, like they taught enough. But they would all essentially just say, ask the client what the problem is, ask the client if they've been hypnotized before. If they have, ask them how. And then if you know how to do that way of hypnotizing them, do it, because they've already, if it worked, that is, then do it because they've already told you that's what they want, or that's what works for them. If they have, and it's perhaps been multiple, oh, I've been hypnotized lots of times, then you could use one of the types of ways that they suggest. If they've not had any hypnosis before, then just give them a little spiel about what hypnosis is and that it's perfectly fine, it's safe, etc., 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 and then say close your eyes. And then what I was always taught essentially was, and then just do a body scan induction, and then have them in their own mind, perhaps walking down into a country garden, and once they're in the garden, then you say sit on a bench, and while they're sat on this bench, hypothetical sort of bench in this garden, then you just tell them the script for whatever they've said their problem is, and then you bring them out, and then you spend 15-20 minutes making sure they're okay to drive home or whatever, and that they're not fast asleep. And so it's pretty much find out what the person wants help with, find out whether they've been hypnotized, and hypnotize them, read a script to the therapy bit of a script to them, count them out, send them home. Make sure they're conscious and alert, and then send them home. And so that's what I kind of used to do, but I used to feel so uncomfortable with that because I found that's quite abrupt, and I'm not very good with abrupt. Like even the sleep meditation creation sessions, I'm not good with abrupt. I'm not very good at, right, I'm live, start telling me words, I'll start writing these words down. So I'm not very good at that kind of thing, of that sort of abruptness. And so I want that kind of gentle, let's get comfortable with each other first type of stage. And that's what I would end up doing. So I would just want to be curious, and I'd ask the person about their problem or whatever. And I'd often just spontaneously kind of do therapeutic metaphors as part of just having a conversation, essentially. And then when I started learning, in my opinion, proper hypnotherapy training courses that took many years to do, that ended up going into lots of detail about mental health issues and things, far more than I'd learned on previous hypnosis training courses. That was the point where it was like, well, now I can do proper therapy. This is more in line with how I imagine it should be done. That you have a chat, gather information, build rapport, you do all these sort of things together. And so it was at that point that I realized, no, this is how it should really be done. And I never once wrote down, okay, so this client has that problem, so I need to do that metaphor. And so if I write down this story and I come up with that story idea, and it was never that. It was just literally talk to the client. Yeah, I think so. The pauses, obviously, you're always taught in therapy, in sort of hypnotherapy or meditation, when you learn it. Talk on people's out breath, pause when people breathe in. Even if you're in the middle of a sentence, you're always taught talk on people's out breath. And even if you're in the middle of a sentence, pause when someone breathes in and carry on talking when they breathe out. That's what you're always taught. Some people end up feeling uncomfortable with doing that because you could be talking and then you carry on talking, and people think, I can't just stop mid sentence. So they don't do it. But the trouble is, if you don't do it, you actually make it so the experience for a face-to-face client, or face-to-face meditation, person doing meditation, it doesn't feel deep. It doesn't feel in sync with you and your natural rhythms, because you're now breathing in and they're talking out. And so breathing out because they're talking. If you're talking, you're breathing out. So the person guiding you is breathing out while you're breathing in, and you don't feel in sync with each other. So even though it perhaps, some of these things obviously don't come across so well on YouTube or whatever, when you're face to face, even if you stop talking halfway through a sentence or something, it feels significantly deeper and more in tune with you and more personal, when everything is kind of, this person is talking when I'm breathing out. That is because they're breathing out at the same time as you're breathing out. This person stops talking when I breathe in. Well, that's because they're not talking because they're breathing in as well. So you end up kind of falling into this, feeling this deeper sense of connection with the person. But yeah, I don't see anything odd, obviously, personally, about the pauses. I just see it as, if I ask someone to visualize something or to do something, then because it's not just like I'm telling a story, it's not like I've got a book and I'm just reading a book to someone. I'm wanting the listener, to have an experience. And because I want them to have an experience, obviously, if you suggest something for them to experience, you need to give them time then to actually have that experience. If you don't give them time, how are they going to have the experience? Yeah, sometimes lowering the resolution helps. So to me, for example, when I listen to my own stories back, um, I quite like them because of the fact that I know I've given myself time to have the experience that I'm telling myself to have. Whereas when I listen to some other people's stuff back, they do everything at one pace and don't necessarily pause to give time for someone to have an experience. And then I find that I'm still trying to figure out like how to build. I'm still trying to build the experience of the waves lapping on the shore or something, and they're already on to the fact that we found a cabin, and I'm still stood on the beach, sort of having a sense of being on a beach, trying to figure out the waves. Um, so yeah, so it's um, but it can be odd if you're not used to it, if you're not used to meditation or anything. Obviously, now it can't be too weird because you're still here. Yep. Listen to Dan or go "oh" at the cute cats. Yeah, I've often hypnotized hypnotists without them being aware. Um, I don't think a hypnotist has ever. One of my biggest complaints is that people just worry about the idea of hypnotizing me. So I don't get many people who are willing to even give it a go. Um, and I obviously want people to. So Graham is comfortable and happy to hypnotize me. But other than that, most people sort of think, oh no, but you may notice any mistakes I make. And they're so paranoid that I'm going to notice if they make any mistakes that they just don't want to even give it a go. Even though clearly you could make lots of mistakes as students do on training courses and it still works perfectly fine. Um, there's no, as long as you're not doing anything particularly harmful, then it'll be fine. So, yeah, so it's not, as far as I'm aware, I've not had anyone hypnotize me without me knowing it, as in like what I was doing, of kind of something where the person is going to kind of zonk out and go with it or whatever. I've got the video of me doing the states thing. It's a very, very bad quality video. Like the sound quality is terrible. You'd have to crank your volume right up and probably wear headphones to hear it. But I've got the video of where I'm doing that. It's from about 2003, so I'm quite young in the video. Um, well, yeah, that's what I said. That in the context of the type of thing that I was doing. So that hypnotist that was hypnotized without knowing they were hypnotized obviously knew they were hypnotized once they were hypnotized. They just didn't notice that that's what I was doing with them and didn't notice that that's where they were going. That they were reaching a point where it was like they were suddenly thinking, oh, I want to close my eyes now. I'm kind of hypnotized. It was that, yeah, they obviously had a realization where they knew um, that they were hypnotized in terms of that kind of hypnosis. Obviously, we all get hypnotized every day without necessarily realizing it, where you suddenly become responsive to something and don't even notice you've done that. you become responsive to a certain sound or something, and you don't realize that you've become responsive to that sound. Yeah, that was just telling a story. I can't even remember the context of why, um, but about uh, wearing a rubbish bag, a black bin liner, because I was painting in the children's home and I didn't want to get my clothes dirty. So I just got a black bin liner, punched 2 holes in it, punched a hole in the bottom of it for the neck, and I had myself a dress. And then answered the door to the police because they came round. Not for me, they came round for an issue to do with one of the teenagers. For a while, Graham and myself, as many of you I think know, um, used to do a regular live podcast together, a bit like these live streams, except there was Graham and myself on camera. I used to use, I'm trying to think what it was called now. I can't think of the name of it now. I knew it the other week because I remember thinking about it again, reminiscing. But we used to use a video podcast type service, and Graham and myself. I've got the feeling it's right there in my head. It's just wanting to come out, so it probably will. Graham and myself were doing live podcasts regularly, where the two of us would be in front of the camera, just like I am here with the laptop, and there was a live chat at the side, and then we'd record the live podcast and then upload clips of it. YouTube at the time, you could only upload 10 minutes worth. So we'd upload clips on YouTube. Before that, I used to upload bits to Google Video. Before that, I used to upload bits to MySpace. But from about 2004-ish, Graham and myself were doing this live podcast, probably 2004 till 2007-ish, or 2008, something like that. And we would just sit in front of the camera and have a laugh together while talking hypnosis, doing hypnosis on the viewers, taking viewer questions together, demonstrating things. So if someone said, "How do you do anchoring?" then obviously I would just do anchoring, say on Graham or something as a demonstration. Um, so yeah, we used to do all sorts of things together, and had regularly thought about setting up our own YouTube channel, but we've never got round to that now. The service we used, I think, disappeared long ago, years ago. I think I remember searching for it a number of years ago and couldn't find it, and then, or I found that it had gone, that it was around and it had gone. It's on the tip of my tongue. I can't think what it was called. There are people who follow me on YouTube who have followed me from the days when I used to do that through to the days when I used to upload them and do stuff on MySpace and then upload them to Google Video and upload them to YouTube and whatever. Or yeah, the clips to YouTube. And I've shared, when I did my 10 years on YouTube video, I shared some of the clips from the podcasts from those early days on in some of those 10 years on YouTube videos. Things like, I think I shared the clip of the Darren Brown story of me dreaming about Darren Brown, which was obviously one of the 1 hour podcast live stream things. Yeah, they've probably got the stories. I've kind of got it in my head that I know that it's somewhere there, and I just can't quite get it. But yeah, so I'm determined to think about it. That's probably what the problem is. So we've often thought over the years about doing more, but now we're both kind of too busy and never see each other. Whereas back then, we both saw each other kind of weekly for hypno messing around. We would sort of record all our hypno shenanigans, trying out different things. And so, yeah, so I was kind of live streaming back then before it was really a thing, I think. Was live streaming courses with Graham as well. So Graham and myself would teach courses and about hypnosis, and we would take questions in the live chat, but I would be, say, talking to a real audience, but also being on camera. And exactly, it is fun. So I'd be on camera, there'd be a live chat, Graham would monitor the live chat, I'd get questions from the live chat, I'd also be talking with a live audience. I'd have the live audience, like someone would come up, I'd just say who wants to come up and be hypnotized next, and then someone would volunteer as a demonstration subject. I would then hypnotize them on camera, doing whatever it is I'm teaching. People can ask questions in the live chat. So I was doing all that back in the olden days. Well, I wouldn't go that far. He's someone who, well, as I've said before, had nowhere to live at a point when I said, well, I've got a floor if you want it. If it wasn't for him being homeless, I wouldn't have become friends with him. It's interesting how you meet people. And then he's someone who's happy to listen to me talk about hypnosis and to let me demonstrate on him. And who's willing to hypnotize me back as well, which is always a good thing. Because Graham is someone who, so any of you out there who like Darren Brown and have followed Darren's work for a long time will hopefully know of some of these things. But Graham's been happy to have me, like when I watched Darren Brown do the, technically yes is the answer to that question. I'm sure I'll mention that in a minute. So Darren did a trick where he has a woman standing in kind of a green area surrounded by a forest or something. And he says, close your eyes. And then he's got a spotlight on her, and he can move his hand in front of the spotlight to cast a shadow that she can see through her eyes or whatever, her closed eyes. He says, in a moment, I'm going to reach over and I'm going to remove a brick from the wall that you've got built up in your mind. And behind that wall is all of your deepest, darkest fears. And he kind of does this thing where he then says, I'm going to reach over, I'm going to reach over, I'm going to reach over. And then he gestures, pulling a brick out from that wall. And the girl on the Darren Brown kind of piece then feels an intense rush of fear and what have you. So obviously, once I saw this, my first thing was, Graham, we've got something we need to try. Is it okay if I give you intense fear? And so Graham's like, yeah, okay, we'll give this a go. That sounds fun. So obviously I did that with Graham. Graham's someone who let me then do the whole, we're going to build up a brick wall in your mind. And behind that brick wall are going to be all your deepest, darkest fears, everything you're terrified of, etc., etc., etc. And in a moment, I'm going to reach over and I'm going to remove one of those bricks. And when I do, all of that fear is going to come flooding through. And obviously then Graham's kind of literally terrified. And you're thinking, that works. That's quite good, that is. And then you say, there, you can have the brick back. So Graham let me do things like that. There's things like Darren did a matrix thing of, the person has a spoon and says, look at that spoon and just notice how it starts to bend. And then the spoon appears to bend and stuff. And obviously the spoon isn't. The spoon is totally fixed and normal and in one place. but the perception of the person through the language being used or whatever makes it look like the spoon is bending, like on the Matrix with the child, where the spoon sort of bends and weaves around, and then the child says about about not being focusing on the spoon, etc., etc. Okay, Graham, here's something for us to try. Let's give that a go. So Graham would be, yep, fine, let's do that. And so then I would make him see spoons bending and twisting and stuff like that. And think, yeah, that works well. That's good. Then there's things like, you mentioned the stabbing. I thought, I've got a brilliant idea. What if we hypnotized you, made your hand numb, and then I stabbed you through the back of the hand with like a needle or something? So we're just in his flat, so like, with a needle or something. Yeah, that could be a fun thing to get on camera. That could be really interesting. So Graham's like, yeah, fine. We can do that. And so there's Graham hypnotized. Firstly, we had to find a needle, so we just found any old random needle in the back of a drawer. Like it was a safety clip that we found. So we found like a large, proper, full-on, thick safety clip, and Graham smokes, so we had some lighters, and so there's me hypnotizing Graham, telling him, your hand's numb, it's just like a piece of wax, etc., etc. Then it's like, just slap your hand down on the table, your hand's totally numb, it's fine. And Graham's eyes are open, we're both just chatting while we're doing this, we're just hypnotizing. You don't need to have your eyes shut for this. So Graham's looking at the back of his hand, and then I'm there, with opening the safety pin, and then a lighter, kind of just make sure this is safe. Sort of lighting the end of the safety pin, making sure that it's definitely, anything on it's dead. Then kind of blowing it off a bit so that I can get rid of some of the wax, probably putting my own germs back on the thing I've just cleaned. And then, like, with one hand, lifting up some of his skin and then trying to push through the safety pin, and I couldn't get it through. So I've technically tried to stab him, but I couldn't manage to get it through his skin. And Graham's there saying, no, you need to push harder. And I'm going, I literally am pushing as hard as I can, and I can't get this thing through your skin. So I'm there sort of wrenching up the skin on his arm, and I'm trying to ram through the pin, and I couldn't get it through his skin, and he's telling me to push even harder. And I'm sort of thinking, I can't push any harder. I can see the spike of it trying to come out the other side, but it's not going through. So it's obviously too thick and too blunt. So so we would often kind of do these different experiments. We did things like experimenting with the idea of astral traveling, and he's a reptile. We're experimenting with things like the idea of astral traveling, thinking, could it be a thing or not? It probably isn't, but you just give everything a go. Why not? And on video, you can see the camera has autofocus, and the camera defocuses at the point that I was sure. I said to Graham, and you see me say this on video, or you probably can't now, because I used to have to record over all the videos, because I only had like one VHS videotape, and I had to record everything on it and keep recording over it. And I said to Graham on the videotape, when he came round after doing the astral traveling thing, I said, it just looked like you walked up to yourself in the chair, turned your back to yourself, put your feet where your feet are on the floor, lined yourself up, looked behind yourself at yourself sitting in the chair, and then sat down in your body to make sure you were going to sit down exactly where you were and not miss yourself. And Graham said, well, yeah, that's just what I did. But I just had this sense that that's what I just observed him do. And on camera, you just see that the camera defocuses for a moment while I say, as if it's tried to focus on something just between myself and Graham, where I talk about him astral traveling and then coming back into his body and whatever. And obviously I've talked before about Graham letting me do the or Graham saying he wanted to know what it'd be like to live an entire lifetime. So I had him go from being born to dying in 5 minutes while I went and put the kettle on and made a cup of tea. So Graham did that. Graham wanted to know what he might think of if he did past life regression. So I did past life regression with him, and he went back to his different past lifetimes. Obviously, I believe it's all just metaphorical, but he did that, and we had all this um, experience. We wanted to do future projection, and so we did that, and that's the example where I've told before, where exactly what I wrote down about what he said happened on that date at exactly that time in exactly the way he said, and was only possible because of the situation of what we did. So obviously I've told that story before, but there was that one. um there are so many different times of Graham and myself experimenting with hypnosis. Obviously, I did the art improvement thing with Graham to improve his art ability. We did a music improvement thing with him, and he instantly he can play instruments just reasonably well without any lessons. Um, so there's so much that we did. I helped him to improve his range at singing by doing a kind of a multiverse singing technique, a multiverse technique with him, where I had him go into multiple universes simultaneously to learn how to sing with a greater range. And then once he'd learned that in all the universes, come back together and then open his eyes and come back to the room. And he came back to the room with his throat hurting and was able to hit a greater range of from lower to higher. And whenever I would think of something that I'd think, I've got this idea. So Graham would often end up saying to me, "You keep impressing me." Not as like a big-headed thing, but he'd keep saying, "You keep impressing me. You do these things. You just suddenly say, I got this idea. Can I try it on you?" And it works. Like there's a non-verbal induction video. I think this is on my channel, and people just don't believe it's a non-verbal induction. The number of people who in the comments say, "Oh, I can tell that you're using binaural beats there. You're using beats to try and control his mind, and that's what's causing that." Or all you did was turn the sound down, and you're really talking to him, but you've got the sound turned down so that we don't know it. Or you've already pre-hypnotized him, and you've told him this is how he has to respond, like a post-hypnotic suggestion. When I do this, you do that. But to Graham, it was just a case of I went over and said, "Is it okay if I just quickly do something with you?" And he said, "Yeah, okay." And so I then just started moving his hand around. So I would pick it up when he breathed in, lower it down when he breathed out, lower it down in a jolt with every blink that he did. And as time went on and I built rapport, jolt the downward bit with the blinks slightly longer with more emphasis to imply go even deeper, keep those eyes shut. I was moving it in small movements in time with his heart rate as well. So there's multiple rhythms kind of, going like that and then go and doing it all in time with his rhythms. And eventually he builds rapport with what's going on with his hand. And then I just rest his hand down gently on his, so it's resting his fingertip on his leg. And I just leave him there. And he went into a very deep kind of state of hypnosis. And thought, how on earth did that just happen to me? And I've done that with lots of other people in demonstrations in front of groups as well since then. But when I did it with Graham, that was my kind of first time where I just suddenly thought, I've just got an idea of something. I wonder if this would work as an induction. And so it was instantly, "Graham." No, I wasn't talking in the slightest. All I said was, "Do you mind if I quickly try something with you?" He said, "Yes." And then I just reached over and did it. So I never said a single word. And on the video, the sound is on and we're in a pub and you can hear the background music in the pub. So that obviously that's so that the sound is on. You can hear the background music in the pub. And I'm just taking a couple of minutes or about a minute and a half or something, to just match his rhythms with the movement of his hand and then lead those rhythms with that movement. And that's it. That's all I'm doing. I'm not doing anything else. I'm not doing any talking or anything. And then there's another video of me where I hypnotize a whole circle of people by getting them to hypnotize each other. Oh, have you found it? But yeah, so Graham would always be kind of up for trying pretty much anything, but also was happy to hypnotize me in return as well, where most people aren't prepared to do that. So we have passed the 3-hour mark. Next time I'm reading the last part, which is therapy in action. So what it is an entire therapy session transcribed with my cut-in commentary explaining what I'm doing. Kind of every time I do something of significance, I then say, here's what I just did and here's why I did it. The idea of it is that everything you've learned from these 2 books is then demonstrated essentially in that book, where you can, or in that chapter, where you can kind of hear it in how it, rather than hearing like a little snippet of a language pattern or something, you can hear how the whole thing flows when it's done in a real session. And you can then, if you haven't already, watch the video that I shared of this session, the art improvement video, where you can then see it. And once you see it, after you've heard me talk about it, you'll then be able to watch it play out. I will read it in one. See, I misunderstood what you meant, first of all, when I saw read it in one go or break it up. I first thought, did you mean I'd read like part of it and then another part another day? But I know now that you don't mean that. My brain figured it out before my mouth, after my mouth had started even. I will probably regularly stop to give time to see how you're getting along with it, see if you've got any other comments on what I'm saying. I might stop more frequently. It depends. If my eyes seem to think that it looks like the live chat is moving along a bit, like people are asking some questions, then I might stop more. If the live chat doesn't seem to be moving much, then I might kind of keep going, thinking that maybe you don't have any questions yet. So I might kind of take it from how the live chat goes. Nope, not yet. The thing that was on the tip of my tongue was obviously the service that I used to use, and I can't remember what it was. It was a short name, and it no longer exists. And I used to use it for all of my podcasts and sharing audio tracks, because it's a podcast site. It let you do live streaming podcasts, and it also let you upload audio podcasts. So that meant that essentially I was able to do my live streaming video podcast with Graham, and then I could just upload my audio self-hypnosis, meditation, all these other tracks. I used to upload those as well to the same podcast service as audios, so people could then download the audios or watch and join into the video podcasts live, and then the video podcast would also be there. Stickam, that's what it was. It was called Stickam, as in Stickam. So I remembered it just in time. Yeah, that's always a good one, something like that. So yeah, so Stickam is the name of the service that I used to use. It doesn't exist now. And that's what I did all of my podcasts and everything's on. So anyway, thank you all for joining me here again. Feel free to give thumbs up, etc. And if you're not a subscriber, although I don't think there are many non-subscribers in the live chat. If you're not a subscriber, feel free to subscribe. And tomorrow we will finish the book, and hopefully everything will then make sense. So thank you all again for joining me here.